Hello and welcome back to Week in Review with the one and only Doooovid. I'm your host, George Venturby, joined tonight by the incomparable Doooovid, here to talk about the Week in Review and whatever the heck we feel like. So, very excited to be here tonight with you, Doooovid. I'll hand it over to you for the introduction.
Oh yeah, Jennifer, good to be back. Hope everyone had a good week and enlightenment. I streamed quite a few days this week with Luke Ford. I visited my 91-year-old grandmother in Ohio, outdoor visit. The nursing home was very strict in Ohio. COVID-19 is a big risk when we talk about COVID-19. Dr. Fauci comes out and claims that it's likely that it's mutated to a more infectious form, and that's why the numbers did not die down in the summer. And my area schools do not look to reopen. It's very few schools are planning on reopening, as in the West here, usually Labor Day, September, the beginning of September is when schools reopen. So I thought that pretty interesting, and like me and Jennifer will do a stream on that. Besides that, nothing particularly interesting and big updates. But still studying Stephen Wolfram and a lot of literature and various topics that hopefully we'll get to. And Janmashtami was this week, and I mentioned it last week, so I chanted a Hare Krishna, and I guess I'll chant another Hare Krishna tune this week, another 3-part structure, hero's journey, I guess, example. And I was thinking, Janmashtami with Tuesdays for a Hare Krishna temple, it's basically the biggest holiday of the year. Rath Yatha, the chariot festival for Lord Jagannath, is usually outdoors at a different location. So even though the Rath Yatha might be bigger than John Mastami is actually in the temple itself. And this year was COVID-19, and so we did our best to put together programs. Both temples, um, the temple in Farmington Hills still has majority encouraged online services, but John Austin biggest day of the year they had to have a program, and so we did our best with the COVID-19 restrictions. Everyone had masks. We had a guy checking temperatures to before people could do darshan, and there was outdoor, and people spraying hand wash. So we tried to, and it was relatively a fraction of what would have been during a regular year. So maybe not even more than 100 people, but in regular years could have been over more than 1,000. But still, there was some level of, yes, we could probably safely function, and I guess generally high impulse control people. So the synagogue still, you have outdoor prayer services, um, and anyone who knows the ISKCON, the Hare Krishna movement, knows the day after John Mastami is Prabhupada's appearance day, and so I didn't go to Detroit for John Mastami. We also tried to have a safe social distance, COVID-19 mask required, safe celebration. But the day after is just a handful of people to celebrate the coming of the spiritual master. And as one person had mentioned, um, in praise of Prabhupada, that basically everyone else came to America to take, to get rich, to fulfill their desires and destiny. As where Prabhupada came to America to give the teachings of the Vedas in order to benefit the people of North America by a belief that the power of Krishna and the Vedic teachings in and of itself is a gift to all of humanity, and like the gospel is a bearing of good tidings of the Vedic wisdom. So this week with John Mastami, biggest holiday of the year, I think Radhastami comes up shortly after the appearance day of Radha. So here's this was, I have it on my YouTube channel. I could put in the link. A simple 3-part popular Hare Krishna tune. This was one of my favorites in the beginning. It's kind of upbeat with the variation. Um, it may not fit into the typical. It fits into the 3-part structure. It may not look in the same way, kind of like the hero's journey that the other tunes you did, but will have at least musically styled like an accentuated 3rd part. So the musically, the 3rd part is the high point of the chanting. That the part that requires the most physical exertion to be able to chant it properly, and through group chanting. Generally the first, it wouldn't just be chanted 1, 2, 3. It would be chanted, the first part many times, and the second part many times, and that process might lead, a whole congregation to largely ecstatic chanting. So the music is part of the process, Harinam Sankirtan, and so in honor of John Mastami, one of my favorites. Um, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, actually, the third high part slipped my mind right now. I was about to go to it, but then I realized that I was switching the tunes. But still, a lot of times it's sung even without the third high part, and that one's a pretty nice one for outdoor chanting and street chanting. So if you want like a nice, lively tune that could connect people on like a New York subway station or a busy place where thousands and thousands of people are walking by, that's a very popular, uh, good chanting tune that actually the tune itself, I would say, usually entices outside people to join in. So there's certain tunes they're chanting that if you're doing street chanting are unlikely to attract other people to join in. That's one of the tunes that if you chant it, it's likely that random people like on the subway would just start dancing and chanting with you, and it's probably something special about the tune itself.
Well, I think that's what the Prabhupada people say, that chanting Lord Krishna's name is the only way to achieve moksha in the Kali Yuga. I think I've heard that quote a few times. I think I actually saw it at the beginning of a Prabhupada book at one
Yeah, I mean,
point.
I've said it. It's in the other literature from Lord Chaitanya, the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and it has kind of like this nice. I think it's actually Bengali expression, but like it is the only way. It is the only way. It is the only way in this age of quarrel and hypocrisy. The only way to, I forget the exact words, but some sort of salvation or survival is uh, chanting the holy names. It has that repetitive structure three times. It is the only way. It is the only way. It is the only way. But the statement, the karma of Kali Yuga, you could expect that quarrel and hypocrisy is going to be the norm. There is nothing you could do about the current state of karma, that quarrel and hypocrisy is always what we're going to see in human interaction. And the only way to combat that is, the mysterious, magical power of the names of God. At least that would be the theological structure, and it could even be expressed in a scientific manner, like most Vedic sciences, sound vibrations and mantra could that could correspond to like Kabbalistic concepts like tikkun and correction, but that the mantra itself is the cure to the current illness of hypocrisy and quarrel.
Yeah, I had a theory about that. And it was like, you remember that that time I showed the it was, I don't know if it was a video or a GIF or what, but it was the MIT research showing a quantum waveform moving on an egg. Do you remember that one?
Vaguely, yeah, I think so, but it's not putting a picture clearly in my head.
I can display it on the internet share, but I had a theory about that. So I don't know if you remember, Doovid, or if the audience remember, but one of the aspects of my theory is that the mind's a quantum computer, and there's this big computer, and it generates these things, which are called microstates, and then it reuptakes the microstate. So there's like a cycle, right? So your mind both generates thoughts and also absorbs them. And the idea is that for that to be possible, they have to be coherent with each other. And so I got this theory that, well, that must mean that the function itself is in base E, because base E is defined to be its own derivative, right? So the base X is found by saying d dx equals X. So let's find a function, or sorry, d dx of e to the x equals e to the x. So it's basically a number that when you take its derivative, you get the same. That's the definition of E. And it turns out to be about I think it's like 2.7 something. You know what E is, right, Doovid? I'm displaying the waveform on the screen right now, so you can have a look if you're interested to see it there. I think it's really beautiful. So back to this Krishna thing. So we have this idea of a quantum mind and how it has to have a base E, which is 2.71. And we can kind of see in that shape how, notice how when the twirls come to fruition, like there's three of them in the center, but they're overlapping. So that area is kind of like E, right? So you have this E that's sort of woven into the fabric of life, and you start from 1 and you go to E, because you start with like a 1 undivided whole quantum form, and then you go to E. And my theory was that Krish was the sound that the waveform was making as it was being divided up into approximately three parts. So like Krishna is like the root of quantum subjective consciousness. That was my little theory, my little pet theory. I don't know if it's any good, but it's definitely a beautiful word, and it has a certain like cuttingness to it, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's a similar thing, definitely between the Kabbalah and the Vedas, and possibly other spiritual systems that say it's actually the sound vibration of the correctly pronounced chanted mantra that scientifically changes reality, karma, so to say, and that if properly understood and demonstrated, the science of mantra is actually could be verified as a physical phenomenon.
I'd really like to do that. And I haven't really got that far in that plan, but matter waves are, I think, where we would have to go to give a formalism that would actually prove that, because we'd need to find the matter waves for more complex entities, right? So the idea is that Sanskrit is onomatopoeic. So every single word in Sanskrit actually sounds like the thing that it's describing. So it's consonant with its matter wave. So I'll display that as well if people are interested. I know I come back to this a lot, but this is basically one of the more important aspects of.
We'll take I have the multiple truth hypothesis, but generally, what Jennifer is saying, the Kabbalists espouse the same thing about the Hebrew language.
That it's onomatopoeic, because I never actually saw that used before, but I feel like that's the right word for Sanskrit. So are you saying you've heard the Hebrew scholars describe it as onomatopoeic, or that it's, how exactly did they describe it? Because that's very interesting.
The neo-Kabbalists will try to put it in a scientific language of wave vibration, because that corresponds with physics. Historically, the Kabbalists seem to think that it was just kind of letters that came out of your mouth or some small form, or to say that the basic particles of the universe are in fact Hebrew letters. So, I mean, I'm not a expert in Kabbalah like that to know there's like a wide variety of sources and literature, but my guess from my knowledge would be that the majority of pre-Enlightenment thinkers generally, although there might be a few historical ones that you could lean to that were predicting a wave understanding, but they believe that some sort of like tiny letters that emanated, not like waveforms. However, saying the neo-Kabbalist understanding it now will almost always use the language of waves, even though the so to say literature would hint towards no, we don't mean waves, we mean like tiny Hebrew letters.
Well, that's very fascinating. We got Howie Hellbent in the chat. He would like to come on. We have already plans to have Michael Cisco on. So if it's okay with you, Doovid, I'll send him the link, and we can have you afterwards, Howie. And we'd love to have you both on. Awesome. Yeah, Michael Cisco has started streaming on YouTube. I think he's done two streams this week so far. So good for him. And I'll be sending him the link. I'm not sure when he's going to be able to make it on, but he is interested to come on and talk about what he's been doing. And yeah, that should be great. And thanks to all the audience members for joining. Really appreciate it.
He hasn't given us an update in like 6 months. I mean, like a year. When there's a long, like definitely many months. I mean, if you're in contact with him, is he the one I keep on noticing every once in a while in like articles related to like political candidacy and elections?
Yeah, he's still involved in political movements. I'm not sure to what extent he's involved. I know he did have a bit of a media controversy that I didn't look too deep into, but now I think he's mostly focusing on his website, and that's up and going. And now he's been talking to a couple different people. I think he actually, I'm not sure who it was he had a couple days ago. It might have been a pastor even, but they were talking about religion mostly. So he's got the link now, and hopefully he'll be able to make it on. And
I
yeah.
peruse a lot of media, and I'm pretty sure like I come across his name in media like every few months, and maybe it's like regarding so to say supporting controversial right wing political candidates, but like, I don't know if he's if the right person that's what he's doing now, and that he's involved maybe even with multiple different candidates, but I see him largely in liberal media because I consume mainstream media, all types of media. But I see his name every once in a while, that, just as like giving an official statement for a campaign or something. I forget the name of the politicians. But if that is the case, good for him. If I'm mistaken, glad he's coming back to Week in Review, and certainly streaming. Whatever he's doing. If was doing podcasts before.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name of it because I
Was
know
it
I was.
Earth?
That's it, Hearth and Home, possibly. Okay, now I don't want to misquote it, but yeah, he was doing those podcasts, and I recorded a couple, and now I think he's shifted most of his focus onto his website, which we can have a look at once he gets here. So that'll be a lot of fun, and I can pull up his YouTube channel as well once he's here, and we can have a talk about it. And I'm not sure what Howie wants to talk about, but he seems interested in the Kabbalistic notions that that Doovid knows a bit about there, so that's great.
So do you want to start talking about the COVID-19 updates before anyone comes on, or did you have something else you want to discuss?
Um, I have had a pretty slow week. I've mostly been researching stuff about economics because, for those of you who've been paying attention to my opinions, I feel like the COVID is mostly distraction. The hysteria surrounding COVID is mostly distraction for economic implosion. So I'm mostly studying economics. So I thought it was a pretty big deal that I think it's Warren Buffett is his name, who he released his investment profile very recently, and he dumped U.S. banks for Canadian gold mining companies. So that is very interesting because the devaluation of commodities does seem to be a requisite cause for the valuation of other things like derivatives and so forth. So if they start to go up in price, it'll be interesting to see what happens elsewhere. That's where my focus has mostly been, tracking various commodity prices. And but yeah, we can definitely talk about COVID because health is super important. Whether or not it's overblown, it's you can never overestimate the importance of staying healthy. So what did you want to focus on? Did you notice that the place where they did in Europe, where they didn't even do a quarantine, that they are supposedly having lots of, like, that they're recovering? I want to say Sweden, but I'm not sure.
Yes, Sweden, I think, is the one that had very limited or no lockdown, and they had substantially more deaths, but generally it's unclear if there was any worse, or what that demonstrates. And I haven't seen the latest numbers, but they never closed their schools down, as opposed to the nations that in Europe that had full lockdowns and were largely able to get the numbers down small enough to have semi-reopening. But I don't think there's any country that's like fully reopened. All countries across the world now are in states of partial lockdown, and generally the number of infections globally is at all-time highs. That it's spreading right now mostly in South America with huge numbers, and in America that now we've been well over 50,000 cases a day for like a month. And it's very likely, if you look at the graphs, it's going to be 100,000 of cases a day soon. Dr. Fauci gave an interview uh, with like Army personnel. I mean, I can post a link if someone needs. And he claimed that they think that there definitely is a variation of COVID-19 now where the ACE2 receptor protein is mutated to a form that binds better, and they think that the experts had predicted that COVID-19 would decline in the summer and then reemerge in the fall under colder temperatures, and coronaviruses in general that cause common colds um, historically spike in I think December. I think December, but there's an annual cycle of like November, December, where coronaviruses in general spike. Whether this one will have that pattern, but the reason that the numbers did not decline in the summer is likely that it's because it mutated to a more infectious type, but it had, God forbid, could mutate to a more deadly form. God forbid, that's still possible. And also the Russia-Israeli supposed vaccine that's working very well, that's cured 3 people so far. See more, is that possible? Um, this vaccine in Russia that Putin himself is taking, what's that likely? And then God forbid, from seeing my grandmother this week, and that like there's really no way for me to see my grandmother, and looking at it where um, in my area just schools are not reopening. It's just not happening. um, who knows, like George Floyd protest 2.0, a lot of things could happen, societal effects like return to normal. We closed down schools, and now the new school year is coming, and most schools look like they're not reopening. I think it's going to be huge, and we could talk about that in detail. But just to wrap up the general COVID-19 update is that seeing my grandmother in Ohio that has very strict regulations on nursing homes, it's unlikely I'll see my grandmother for a whole year. And that's a conservative estimate. And, thank God I made flowers for her, garlands from my garden, marigolds, and brought it down. It was like, but I had to give it at the desk in front. And I mean, there's a whole process and procedure, and it's important because like COVID-19 is deadly, especially to elderly people. But you're saying realistically, we're going to be in these lockdowns, according to the experts, at least another 6 months, possibly years. And then, what people are saying that maybe we'll be out of lockdown in like 6 months to a year, because they're basically saying we're not going to be out of lockdown until there's a vaccine. And in reality, there's no guarantee that there will ever be a vaccine. We're hoping that there'll be a vaccine, in the next 6 months. But even that is a conservative estimate, and a more realistic estimate right now is years. So it's interesting to say, just to accept that reality, look at the new normal going forward, and then what do people do? You're saying, thinking like, expect to be wearing masks and social distancing for a few years. And also, God forbid, when it gets colder, saying that we had hoped, if you're here in the U.S. or areas where cases are high, we had hoped that in the summer we would have a little bit of like a break from it, so that we would be able to prepare for it in the fall. But Dr. Fauci saying now that it mutated to more infectious forms, so we didn't get a break in the summer. So in the fall, when it naturally becomes more infectious and worse, and there's already 50,000 cases a day, God forbid, it could be hundreds of thousands of cases a day. And and God forbid, it could mutate to a more deadly form. So the state of COVID-19 still um, relatively is the most scary it's ever been. It's not better than it was, although from the perspective of, is it overblown? Just because we're at the worst case, objectively, the worst case scenario as of now has basically happened. And anything moving forward is likely to just be more bad news and not good news. But what is a realistic estimate? And like the Sweden model is like saying like you say no, there is no safe way to open up schools in the U.S. I'm sorry, schools will not be opening this year. There is no safe way to do it. End of question. And even look at reality. Joe Biden is running. Does Joe Biden honestly think he's going to get elected president of the United States saying vote for me and I'll force you to wear a mask for 3 months? I mean, it almost just like mind-boggling that that's his strategy, and he's actually buying in my state, Michigan, and other states. They're spending tens, hundreds of millions of dollars on TV targeted ad campaigns that are saying vote for Joe Biden. He'll force us to wear a mask for 3 months, and maybe they're right. Saying God forbid it's going to be like this for years, and you should be so lucky to only have to wear a mask for 3 months. Expect to wear a mask for the next 3 years. So like I did want to express how serious I think the situation is, and not saying the fear mongering you're hearing now is saying we've been talking about this for months, and at least if you're here in the U.S., we didn't beat this thing. In fact, it's at the worst it's been.
Yeah, it's tough to know, because it's like you hear stuff in the news and then you know life goes on, and sort of at some point it's like,
Well, death has been decreasing, but here in Michigan now, even in the middle of the summer, we're starting to have tens of deaths a day now. God forbid. It had been down to in the singles of deaths, even though cases have been relatively high. Like we're over 1,000 cases a day now. We had been over 500. We had been down to like under 100 cases a day for a period of time, and then we had the uptick, and now we're back over 1,000 cases a day. So God forbid, it's possible that we've gotten better at treating it. It's unlikely that it's mutated to a less deadly form. Just because it's more transmissive doesn't mean necessarily it's more deadly. And Dr. Fauci said that that's not the case. It's just more transmissive. It's not more deadly. Um, However, besides the fact that we're a little bit better at treating it now, God forbid, it's likely that the death rate is going to be what it had been before. And if Michigan now is producing 1,000 cases a day, that means in a few weeks, 2 to 3 weeks from now, we're going to have 50 deaths a day. God forbid, and you're going to see that across the country, and it's already ticking up. Here in America, and it's not net. I'm not saying to be scary. This is reality, and we'll do only as good as we can do is adapting to reality, just like Roma Pada, the head of the Hare Krishna movement, saying like, good, I don't want us to return to normal. In fact is we all knew the present state of karma in the world was not that good. So like coronavirus is not a big surprise, because any spiritual person knows that the current state of karma in the world is not all that great. So just like we've always had the chance to repent, and believers in free wills, and take our life into our own hands, and take karma into our own hands, and so to say save the world. But you could look at COVID-19 as an opportunity to rapidly change society, but largely, God forbid, because people are fearing for their lives. People are willing to change our action basically purely out of fear of death, fear of sickness, suffering, and death. But COVID-19 right now, really, it's a minimal fear of death, but it's enough for people where wear masks. That's quite a bit. Saying no one wants to wear a mask, but the fear of death is real, and people see no, this is killing people. That it's a 1 out of 1,000, 1 out of 100 chance. I'm scared. I don't want to die. I'm wearing a mask. And it's a crazy development. I don't know where you're at, but where I'm at, it's mandated now by law. Everywhere I go, basically everyone has masks.
that's pretty amazing, isn't it? I'm surprised that there hasn't been more pushback, because I imagine it's hard to breathe for some people, like especially older and infirm people, people with asthma or bronchitis or something like that. Like a mask is pretty rough.
Well,
I
it
think,
largely just precludes their social activity. So, like I limit my social activity. I think I'm getting a little chubby now, just because ordering off Amazon food is so efficient. Um, but yeah, most people are just limiting their social activity to only essentials, and even elderly people are limiting, saying, okay, like now I'm shopping online, or I'm going to early elderly hours, that the first hour or something in the morning is reserved for elderly people, or these various things that the massive shift in what it used to mean to live in America has already happened, and life in America right now is completely different than it was a few months ago. And is saying that don't think we're going to be returning to normal. The experts are saying it's going to, even that Joe Biden is telling you he wants to force everyone in the country to do it, for at least 3 months. That you're talking. He wouldn't become president till January. So, like, if Joe Biden wins, Joe Biden is telling us that we're going to be wearing masks in April of next year.
yeah, it's a quite a fascinating and shocking series of developments. We are joined today by Mr. Michael Cisco. Welcome, as well as Howie. We'll say hi to you in a minute, Howie. But I wanted to get to Michael first because he's been out and about contributing to the culture on the internet. For that, we are very thankful. I've got your website here, Saints Edward Media. And how you doing today, Michael? Welcome to the show.
I'm good. Thank you for having me on. It's been a while. It's been a minute. And here's what my Victorian library actually looks like in real life.
You know what? I didn't even know that was a green screen. Like, normally I can tell because the people have this like alien green sort of outline on their face, But yours was so pro, I couldn't even tell. Like, I literally believed that library was really there, or it was plausible at least. So how are you finding it? That you're on YouTube, you're doing some streams. How's that going?
Pretty good. I keep all of my streams start out with the microphone not working. So I'm not sure if it's the mics or my USB ports or something. But I mean, eventually it gets fixed, and the shows are turning out well. For a new show, pretty good engagement, lots of comments, which is exciting. So. But I guess some people transferred over from the podcast, so it's always fun.
Wait, am I right that I see your name in the news every few months or weeks, like related to like political candidacies or various things, or like mainstream articles about candidates that are maybe controversial, and like you get quoted as am I right? That's you?
Yeah, that's me. I'm the far right figure in the background now, evidently. So,
but I was telling Jennifer, I usually send it to her every few months. Like, I come across your name in, I don't even know, like Huffington Post or wherever I'm checking, that just has some random article, and then it's like Michael Cisco says, maybe even like covering protests, or is it just like a specific candidate, or you have multiple candidates?
So I was on I started out on, I guess the first one that made the news was I was working for Bobby Schilling in Iowa. And then I ended up taking credit for inviting Nick Fuentes to speak at an event. And that, so obviously that went down the drain pretty fast, and I made the front page of the paper out there. And then I hopped on Lauren Witzke's campaign. I can actually talk about it since it's not my platform. Therefore, there's no FEC violations. But yeah, I was her campaign manager for the first 6 months of her campaign, and then I left for some personal reasons, and I made the news quite a bit just for being her campaign manager. Nothing controversial happened. It was just, they tap into my old podcast and the incident in Iowa with the Schilling campaign. And so I was just a name that just kept. It was almost like Bannon, like Steve Bannon with President Trump type thing. And of course, most of it was all taken out of context. And
But I mean, if one of those candidates won that, you wouldn't mind becoming staff and, like a congressional staff or something, that would be, like that in theory is your plan. Like eventually one of these candidates are going to win.
Well, it's likely that Lauren will win. She's definitely going to win her primary, and she has a chance to win the whole thing. I still help her out with some media talkers. Like, she'll come to me for that. But it's a possibility that I could be on her staff if she wins. I don't know.
By the time she wins, there might be so many people that have helped her even more than you helped her that there'll be no room for your own congressional staff.
I think there's plenty of room on a Senate staff, but am I in the position to be her chief of staff like I once was? I doubt it. But
I think there's an exact amount of budget that they get for staff, a few $100,000. There's a payment, and then there's an allowance for a budget for a congressional or Senate staff. But it's
I'm not really sure that I want to do it, to be honest, because I would obviously consider it, but I really want to build my little media company and get that going, and I keep getting sidetracked by all of these, professional gigs. And that's, the more I put my own business on the back burner, the slower it's going to grow. And I think I could do more good, honestly, kind of just doing that. Because then I'm less restricted with what I say. I don't have to worry about everything. I don't know. People are trying to talk me in the running for the midterms, so I don't know what I'm going to do.
It's great to hear that you're forging forward in your own direction, at least partially. And I've got your video from yesterday, from early, actually, maybe it was earlier today, your last interview on your show. And I got to say, that's the best green screen I've ever seen in my life.
I appreciate it.
What do you guys think? I mean, I believe it. I really believe it that he's in that library. I mean, just Stephen James says in his mind it's real. So nice job on that. And so it sounded like who was the gentleman you had? Not this one, but the one before, the one that I was listening to for the majority of the stream. Is he because he said he used to be a Mason, but he's not a priest, is he, or is he?
Oh no, that Michael Witkoff, brother Augustine. No, he's a oblate, at a Benedictine monastery, Orthodox Benedictine monastery. I'm actually an oblate at the same monastery. I just don't go around calling myself Brother Michael. But
could you tell the audience a little bit about what that means?
Sure. So an oblate is a lay person who has a formal relationship with the monastery. So they're like quasi-monastics, but they can still get married. Basically, they are in obedience to the monastery. They are in constant communication with the abbot. It's like a tutelage, like a religious tutelage. And you are committed to praying the hours. So that's at least anywhere from, like, the prayer rule. Honestly, nobody wants to make it impossible, right? So if you have a job, it's kind of around your life, but it's a little more, or a lot more stringent than just your typical lay person. So for me, I do the hours, the 1st, 3rd, 6th, 9th, and then Vespers or Compline. So like 5 or 6. I pray like 5 or 6 times a day, and then we do an hour of Lectio Divina, which is just like reading spiritual writings and kind of meditating on it.
Oh, very nice. So this might be an option for people to pursue a path who aren't quite ready to go the whole hog with maybe becoming a priest or a monk, like a full-blown monk, which would probably require a chastity vow. Although I'm myself, like, from a Catholic background, so I don't know if the chastity vow is the same for all the other Christian denominations there, but this sounds like something for people who still want to live in the real world, but also want to take their spiritual path to the next level, maybe. So that's a good option for people.
Orthodox priests are actually married, but it is a thing. Like if you're considering monasticism, a lot of the oblates are contemplating that, and it's good because you get to visit one of the benefits of being an oblate is you can visit the monastery whenever you want and stay as long as you want. You don't have to pay anything. I mean, well, we pay, generally we also, like I send them money every month. It's just kind of part of it. But I determined how much I could afford to do, so it's not like got to pay this much to be an oblate. If you can't afford it, they won't even make you do it. But I can visit there and stay as long as I want. It's always available to me if I need to get away and be in the mountains with nothing bothering me and just completely detached. It's always there for me. So
Yeah, we would probably get, like, if you wanted to call it Freemasonry or cult craft of some sort of just the organizational structure, even if it was a different religion or, like Hinduism or something, like, yeah, there's some sort of initiation, like a group gathering where there's some sort of ceremony of people, and then, then you're in. And part of that includes probably an oath of some sort, probably acceptance of a current power structure, and then certain privileges, like say like membership, ability to use certain property, and an agreement to do certain rituals that besides for like a brotherhood or just communal rules, that there's also an understanding that there's certain rituals that even if nobody's watching, that that there's some sort of higher power to the agreement that we've accepted and agreed upon doing. And then there's, so to say, levels of initiations or levels of an inner circle, and on the various religions, Catholicism or Hinduism or various traditions, the inner sanctity requires celibacy. But you could still have lower levels of initiation or part, so to say, a function at the castle that doesn't include the main chamber without you're taking the higher level vows. And also, generally in Hinduism, also Catholicism, the vows would also probably eventually, to make it to the inner levels besides for celibacy, would probably also include the renunciation of even all material possessions, period.
yeah, and I mean that's certainly part of the Orthodox monastic is to kind of renounce property. It becomes communal. Everything you have is the monasteries and whatnot. And many saints would describe the celibate path as the angelic path. So like monastic life is kind of closer to the angelic life than living in the world and being married and whatnot. But you also have some disputes. That's not universally agreed upon in the Orthodox Church. A lot of people consider marriage and monasticism equal paths. So I kind of tend more towards that. They both lead to the same place.
We have to say one is better than the other, but in the intersanctum of who could perform the rituals, that there's a certain amount of purity for the intersanctum, and that purity includes celibacy. So not to say one's better than the other, but like, no, you're married, you'll never be performing certain rituals for the congregation because there's a purity level as a married person that you are on a lower level than a celibate without giving some sort of priority of importance.
Yeah, well, our bishops are usually monastic, so I guess in that sense, that's kind of how that's reflected in Orthodoxy.
And I mean, I don't know if you heard the opening, or we do like a mantra. Do you have a belief in like the spiritual science? Like, oh, you're saying at a certain time every day, these certain, so to say, mantras, you chant the exact same thing, the exact same time. Do you believe that that's like countering spiritual forces? Is it just some sort of ritual that's observed that affects you, or prayer? Or do you have some sort of like Hindu mantra belief where it actually spiritually counteracts these spiritual forces?
Well, I did not catch the opening. I was busy getting coffee, but I don't know that the times of the prayers is necessarily thought of to have any correlation to a specific like time of day that's spiritually important. Although there is one of the hours, like the prayer said at noon, that references the noonsday, like Lord protect me from the noonsday demon type. I'm sure I'm paraphrasing, but there is a part of our tradition where we do prayers for the dead, and there's a cut like you'll do the first day, third day, seventh day, and then 40 days after the death, and that's supposed to correlate to their journey on the other side, and like the tolls, we call them toll houses. So there's specific important days after a person's death that they really need prayer and intercession. So we
That
definitely
means that means theologically you would be fundamentally opposed to the concept of reincarnation then, because it would
yes.
contradict your rituals.
Yes. Sorry, Jennifer.
It's okay. Your opinion on reincarnation can't stop it from happening, so I win in the end.
But I'm saying, what about his rituals that are coinciding with the period of time after death? So, I mean, if reincarnation, if the belief of the Catholic purgatory or whatever process that the person dies, and then certain thing happened in, let's say, largely a formulaic process, that it basically the same thing happens to everybody in the same process when they die. And that's why these prayers are said in the formulaic way on these days, because it's corresponding to karmatic processes, if it's for the benefit of the dead or something. And as I'm not sure if Catholicism is so formulaic in a way, like Hinduism would be. And then, as Jennifer say, oh, no, it's reincarnation. They're just wrong. Like the soul isn't going, to some netherland. It's going through reincarnation. But does that mean that these rituals for the soul of the person performed at these specific times still might take an effect on the reincarnated person?
Oh yeah, it'll definitely have an effect, because what it comes down to, what it always boils down to, is intention, right? So, like, it reminds me of a conversation I had with a new friend from Israel. Actually, he reached out because he was interested in what I was talking about. We talked a bit about that, and his mom died, and he was telling me how he was feeling her presence after she had passed, and I was just, kind of counseling him through that, and just saying, like, there's boundaries when you're alive that don't exist when you're dead. So when it's hard to tell what people's intentions are sometimes when you're alive, but when you're dead, that wall comes down. So if it's really about, good intentions. So I imagine even with the Christians, that if their family was praying for them, what would matter to them would be their intention, and that they would feel that and feel good that their family was caring about the fact of caring about the ultimate destiny of their soul. And, realizing that, this is really hell, and reincarnation is what happens until you reach enlightenment. That's something that eventually everybody comes to that realization. So if you don't get in one life, there's always a future life. That's kind of how, at least how I look at it. So I'm less sort of, I don't want to say the beliefs are wrong. They're just, they're not going to bring about the effect of heaven, because that place is not a thing.
Can I plug a book?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we love to hear.
I would say that the best book, in my opinion, this is a little, other Orthodox people will disagree with me, but the best book on the Orthodox Christian perspective of what happens to the soul after death is by Father Seraphim Rose, called The Soul After Death. So that's my
Great.
plug.
So the people in the audience who are interested in checking that out, I know we do have I think we do have some people who are Christian who watch the show. Like, I think overall we're kind of adults, and we're mature enough to be able to disagree without passing judgment or whatever to the point where it's destructive. So I really do appreciate it. And basically anybody who's interested in religion, I respect that, because I think there's a great deal of knowledge that's accessible only through religion. So you're
Well,
really
that's why I
missing out.
promote.
Go
And
ahead.
that's why I'm promoting the multiple truth hypothesis, even say, because I put substantial amount of thought in, eschatology, of the study of the end of days, and obviously systems of reincarnation do not correspond necessarily with systems of heaven and hell. Hence, like, a lot of debates we've had. And so, from the perspective of the multiple truth hypothesis, saying that I could analyze conflicting systems, saying like systems where people believe in a soul and a heaven and hell, or people have different beliefs of different heavens or different realms or different even components. What part of the soul is the person's, or fractions of souls. And there's so many complications. I mean, it's beyond almost classification, let alone reincarnation and systems that reincarnation is the only possibility, or you could have systems where there's at the same time reincarnation and heaven and hell and various options. And the Vedas are probably the most spelt out and well defined of these. The Kabbalistic system is pretty well spelt out, and it is also like a dual system where there are some concepts of heaven and hell and reincarnation, and both of these things working simultaneously, versus what could be most likely to correspond with our understanding of the physical sciences and the philosophy of science. It's like wave vibrations and electric fields or quantum mechanics, in the type way that say, okay, we've had all these theories that the religions and the theologians have given over the years, but do any of those actually correspond to the current state of physical understanding of the sciences? And from that perspective, is like there might be arguments as, okay, reincarnation actually might correspond better with our current understanding of the material sciences, although everybody will try to make their argument, because the world religions are so big, there's so many people of all the various religions, that there's scientists that represent all of them that have done their best to argue that the current state of scientific knowledge, supports the theology of their various system, like hence the multiple truth hypothesis.
Awesome. So yeah, thanks so much for coming on the show, Michael. I don't know if you want to hang around. We usually just have like a week in review type show where we analyze various things, or I don't know what your schedule is like, if you want to hang out while we talk about other subjects, or if you just want to wrap it up. I've posted links to your website as well as your YouTube, so the people in the audience who are curious to check that out, please do. There's at least one person in the audience who said he subscribed because he was interested, so thanks a lot.
Yes.
And we wish you the best of luck with your future endeavors. So yeah, what do you think?
Well, it's up to you. I don't have to wake up early tomorrow. I get to sleep in, so totally up to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk politics, especially if that's what you're involved in. I was just mentioning, COVID-19. It's a different world, and the Biden running on forcing us to wear a mask, for 3 months, which, thinking according to practicality, he means that if he wins and he becomes president in January, that he's going to force us to wear a mask. That means through April, and he's expecting us to vote for him because he's going to be making us wear a mask through April. And so I was saying, I know here in Metro Detroit, Michigan, does not look like we're reopening schools. There's some attempts, some districts, and I could see Trump winning by a landslide just due to the incompetence of the Democratic Party and just this strategy. Like, do the Democrats really think they're going to have a huge voter turnout with, vote for Biden? He'll force you to wear a mask.
Can I intervene here? From my perspective, Trump won the second the DNC screwed over Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah, Howie didn't. I don't know if you saw this, but I think their ratings took. I don't know if they call them ratings or what, but they took a hit as soon as Kamala was named as the VP, right? Like his approval rating went down.
And
I
they've
mean,
been
the big event is actually tomorrow night. So I mean, it's good we're talking about this because the Democratic National Convention, which is going to be online, and probably I don't imagine probably a good few million people will watch it, but I can't imagine it's going to be that interesting. But that is going to be tomorrow night through Wednesday night. It's not just one day. I think it's like 3 days.
Yeah,
they've
well,
been trying to
see.
backtrack and make it seem like Kamala is more popular than she actually is, using every method that they can muster up. I mean, even Sean King, who denounced Kamala before she became Biden's pick, he's now endorsing Kamala and basically saying she's a good pick.
Well, I mean, you say if you have the mouthpieces of the Democratic establishment, the media, the political campaign machine that are blasting these messages. But at the end of the day, like they're going to need 60 million votes. And even if, the mainstream media, but how many people do they reach? CNN, MSNBC, New York Times. At the end of the day, like tens of millions of people, maybe. And, that's why they're pushing for the mail-in voting. And even if all the major political candidates, Obama and all these people come out, the most important election in your lifetime, when the people look at it and they're going to say, Biden, you really want me to, most important election in my lifetime is to force myself to wear a mask. I don't see it like I just think there's extenuating circumstances, and a lot could happen between now and then. But I think it's looking like Biden is headed for disaster, and like Republicans versus Democrats across the nation, that may not be indicative of the presidential race. And Kamala Harris, it doesn't. The media and the people that want to win, they're going to sell whatever narrative they're going to sell, but who's going to tune in to listen if there's not debates or some event or something for millions of people? When Kamala Harris starts being interviewed on CNN every single night at a certain time, there's only going to be a few 100,000 people in all of America, even though she's running for vice president, that are going to tune in to hear her every night from now to November. And it's representative of the current state of the corrupt Democratic Party. It's like Trump saying these people are going to get what they deserve. God forbid, in the major cities, schools aren't going to reopen. They're going to start having extreme financial difficulty, and it's just going to be Biden and Harris saying let's take Trump's money away from tax the rich and give it away, and no plan that makes sense because I mean, Cisco, you're actually involved in, you got candidates running. I mean, what do you think that this, even if I'm right about Biden and the failure of the wear mask strategy, that will have no implication on elections across the country, or you see that could be possible for a huge Republican? I'm just saying a huge Trump victory, and that may not have any implications on elections across the country besides that.
Well, I think because I was in the mud, I just had constant.
With your mask on? Were you in the mud with your mask on?
No, but just being involved so heavily in it and having constant attacks coming from the left.
I have wearing a mask.
Well, no, just in general. I like my perception of them is that there's more of them and that they're stronger than maybe you're that you're conveying. I think it's.
No,
I don't think
first of all, you're right. The demographic advantages to the Democrat. There's 8 million more registered Democrats than Republicans, and I think it's just this COVID-19 that's going to skew the election. That Biden running on "I'm going to force you to wear a mask" is just going to be a disaster.
But you don't think that's maybe a little counteracted by their complete race baiting with the whole BLM stuff?
I mean, that's the opposite, because the most pushback to the, vote for me, I'll force you to wear a mask, is going to be the minorities in the urban area. And especially when schools don't reopen, the coupling of these things is that no, you're not going to be able to get the coalition of minorities to think that Biden's going to really be able to do anything to benefit them, especially as the likelihood that the government's going to start crumbling in essential functions like schools and police and these various things. And Biden's answer is going to be, we're trying to say defund the police, but defund the police and at the same time wear a mask or I'll have you arrested. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. In the media, it's just going to be so bad that no one's going to buy it because they're going to say, yeah, it makes perfect sense to me that you should defund the police and at the same time arrest people who aren't wearing masks. That makes sense. That looks like it'll work.
Yeah. Lost my train of thought. But
the difference between that on the local election, because on local House and state and statewide elections, that may not play out the same way, and then the Democrats still do have the demographic majority. Like largely I'm saying it's the Democrats who really screwed themselves pretty badly by promoting the George Floyd protests so strongly, and the racial angle to the election, like God forbid you have to vote against Trump because he's a racist, and then the where they're positioning themselves to take a stance on the COVID-19, and those are just going to be very unpopular positions.
Yeah, well, there's some indications I've been reading that a lot of the people in these like inner city urban areas, the people, African Americans, largely do not support the defunding of the police. So this might actually what you'll probably see is Democrats, if anything, just stay home and not vote. And so it'll be a turnout thing. And if that's the case, they're just demoralized. Then what you'll see is down ballot effect from Trump. And so it would affect the Senate and the congressional races. And then you typically see the opposite happen during the midterms. Midterms are pretty tough for whatever party the president is. Usually there's always a backlash during the midterms. I can't remember.
There doesn't appear to be much support for defunding the police outside of a radical cadre of radical communists.
Yeah,
I really don't think this is something that speaks to the average American. Like maybe some do-gooder hack in a city thinks that God knows what's going to happen if they defund the police. But I think for most people, most Americans would probably scoff at that proposition.
Well, if the pure political calculation perspective, it was a media ploy in order to try to entice large amounts of African Americans to vote for the Democratic Party, and it may have failed and backfired. But if you take a conspiratorial role towards Democratic politics, yes, that's what they always do, and you could see that they were trying to do it when you watched the media. It was obvious that that's what they're trying to do, and what I'm saying, I think they're going to continue with the same dumb strategy. I think that November, right before election, they're still going to be talking about George Floyd, and it's not going to work in terms of that, and also the immigration issue. The fact that the border's been closed so long has changed the nature of the dynamic of the discussion in America, or even what America is, because the mass immigration, the borders, and the traveling was just so much part of American culture. Now 4 months of a closed border, which looks like it might be prolonged for a period of time, you might also be a pushback against the Democratic agenda, because as I said, the policies look different when the borders open than from when the borders closed.
Yeah, a lot of people just threw in 100% with the George Floyd thing, and I don't know if you guys have seen these. I know there's at least 2 videos that came out. So the original video was an incomplete video, and then there was one that actually recorded the entire arrest process, and then there was another one that was actually inside the ambulance. So when this came out, it sort of painted a different picture than what had originally been put forward, and I think a lot of people, even all the way out to Reddit, sort of realized that they had been deceived. And I don't think it's going to play out too well for the politicians that there's so much like, what is it? Why would you hitch your wagon to that horse type thing? Like, there's so many better examples of police
God forbid.
brutality out there. Why would you pick such an example that could be so easily debunked? Like, why would you not just go with one that actually did represent what it is that you're alluding to, which is this unfair? Well, I think of the main issue, or the legitimate issue, is that African Americans seem to get more prison time for the same crime as European Americans. That's, I think, if people actually step back to look at it, I think that's what the issue is, like this unfair, what is perceived as different treatment between the racial groups. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, this George Floyd case was not really that. It was a person who was, out of their mind on drugs. And
you're looking at the structure of collective karma and how it's built up. So, like, no, I mean, George Floyd and the truth of the matter of what happened between George Floyd and the police at this point for the culture wars is not important. And it's likely that regardless of how the case goes, they will keep on using George Floyd for the purpose of the culture wars, because the point is pushing for which direction society should go, and then the different players and influencers that use occurrences and the ability to manipulate or influence people. So obviously we got big elections right now. They want to beat Trump. You need a coalition. The Democratic Party, you have your demographics of the various people in the coalition and the various reasons, like, this is the most important election of your life. And, therefore you have to, make sure to get out and vote. And so they'll use the various different contradictory methods to rile up the various different bases, if it's the Jews and, Israel or the blacks and police brutality and the various, issues that are most affecting the various communities. So the general media and political establishment will try to kind of bulk up just a generic emotional phase of the masses that you need to get out and vote for our guy, not theirs. And it's mob mentality to a large extent, and it doesn't have to be rational. So no, from that perspective, what really happened with George Floyd at this point, God forbid, is irrelevant. And you will see that the media and the political candidates, probably Biden and Harris themselves, will continue to talk about, God forbid, the racist murder of George Floyd, even though, the released video seems to clearly contradict that, there's probably negligence involved. The man didn't have to die, but there doesn't seem to be any connection to racism. But the point is that, no, the fact that the video is released and people of intelligence could maybe decipher will not change the fact that the Democratic Party and the media establishment will probably continue to go with this till elections. And that's why.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I get it. They're not going to admit that they made a wrong call. My only point was that if this is going on so much,
you said, why did they pick this
example?
one?
Why not find a more cut and dry example is all I'm saying. So John Wolfe is saying,
you have to just go with karma. It's like, God
Breonna Taylor.
Literally, like, I've seen videos that's come out since that would have been better, because there was a guy who was literally in his car and the cops were like, they just shot him dead, and they didn't have to do that. And I think that would have been way more. I mean, I think I'm agreeing with you here. It's like they're not going to let it go because they've already committed to this narrative, even if it's not a good example. And John Wolfe is saying, I'm not excusing what the officer did. I'm not saying I'm excusing what the officer did. I'm saying that it's not a cut and dry. Obviously, the officer was in the wrong, and obviously the person arrested was a total victim. Like, are you really telling me you can't find a more cut and dry example to make the avatar of your movement? That's all I'm saying.
Breonna Taylor was killed in a no-knock raid, and she was asleep in her bed. And all evidence points to this being true. But the officers involved in the killing have not been arrested or detained. And what's being said about George Floyd is much like what was being said about Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. When I first heard about Michael Brown, I heard that a police officer had shot a man with his hands up. But as the months went on and the evidence came out, it had been shown evidentially that Michael Brown had punched the officer in the face, turned around, walked away, and then charged at the officer. And that's when he was shot. And Trayvon Martin had actually attacked George Zimmerman before George Zimmerman shot him. And George Zimmerman had called out for help as well.
Yeah, Howie, did you know that when that case was going through, like, I was literally working with people in the same field as the ones who were doing the analysis on the video material, and this, like, totally fraudulent audio analyst claimed that he was able to identify a voice with just, like, 2 seconds of speech, which is, like, literally scientifically impossible. So there was a lot of fraud just going on with that. We were quite surprised at the level of incompetence that was allowed to testify as an expert witness. So you do get the sense at some point that it's not about what happened, it's about a narrative. But I guess that's already been well established.
With the Trayvon Martin case, the audio of the person screaming for help, Martin's own parents came out and said, "That is not our son screaming for help." And
yeah, it's funny because this, like, quote unquote video audio analyst claimed that he was certain that it was the same person, because what he did was took the recording and copied it and pasted it. So, like, instead of being 2 seconds, he, like, pasted it a bunch of times to make it like 10 seconds. And it was like, it doesn't work like that, dude. That's like doing a frame average by duplicating a frame 30 times and then doing the frame average of that. It's like, you're not getting any new information by duplicating what was originally there.
Yeah, but you'd think that the parents would know best. But they, at the end of the day, they were barred from being able to present that.
And that's just amazing. That's just amazing because the court precedent is that in terms of a voice ID, if you want to play a recording and have someone ID someone via their voice, it has to be someone who is already familiar with the suspect. Like, to just have a random person come in and ID is not allowed. It's not admissible, as they say, whereas testimony of somebody who knows the person is admissible, but it sounds like from what you're saying, they didn't admit it. So that's pretty fishy.
Yeah, the reasoning the judge gave was that the parents of Trayvon Martin were themselves not experts at voice analysis. So
that's incredible.
Their testimony, yeah. But at the end of the day, who would know better than the parents what their own child sounded like?
Well, that's incredible. That's like going against legal precedents, because the precedents, they clearly state that the only person who can voice ID someone who's a layperson is someone familiar with the suspect or the individual. So they're literally going against, like, precedent, legal precedent. That's just amazing. What a world. And that was quite a while ago, wasn't it? Like, that was at least 5 years ago.
That was 2012.
Oh, there you go. So it was like 8 years ago. Wow, time flies, eh? I guess things haven't changed that much.
And, there's this whole narrative about black people in America receive more brutality from the police than any other ethnic group. That's not true. That's not true at all. If you look at the actual statistics, white people make up approximately 4 times the population than black people, and yet we are also killed at 4 times the rate. If you take those numbers, whites and blacks are killed at the exact same rate. And if you look at instances of reported police brutality, whites and blacks report at the same rate. And it sucks because when I bring up this fact, people argue against it by saying, name a victim of police brutality who is white. And as if you have to name a specific case to prove a statistical fact.
But that is almost proving your case, because if police targeting blacks for brutality was all that common, we wouldn't know literally all of their names.
Exactly. But see, I do have names of white people who have been brutalized by the police because I've actually paid attention to this shit for longer than 10 years. I actually worked with Cop Block back in 2013, 2014. And so I'm actually aware of some pretty horrible instances of police brutality involving white people as the victim. Adam Leone, this man who he didn't pull over for the police, so they rammed his car off the road and beat him. And this beating went on for hours and hours. It even continued at the hospital while he was in a hospital bed, and nurses reported that he had sustained injury after being in their care.
So, Howie, what about the sentences? Because if you look at the rates of incarceration, I do believe it's disproportionately to the statistical average of like actual numbers of people that's disproportionately African American. Is that correct? And if that's correct, does that mean that they're being sentenced more harshly? And if that could be established as a fact, is that something worth acknowledging?
I have not looked at the average sentencing between ethnic lines, but I do know that a lot. I do know that the 1350 statistic that might have something to do with that. But there's also evidence that white people also receive equally harsh sentencing. There are people who are still in jail for things which are no longer criminal in the states they are still in jail for, such as marijuana possession back in the 1980s. In New York, if you were caught with marijuana, you would go to jail for life. I think it was a 3 strikes rule, but it was extremely draconian. And there are white men still in jail, despite the fact that those laws have been repealed, and you can no longer go to jail for life in these states for marijuana possession.
Yeah, one thing that they don't consider when they're always showing the disparity in sentencing. So let's say I go out and I commit a felony, right? And I have no prior record. And you're comparing me to an African American that did the same thing, but has like 3 other convictions on his record. He's going to get a harsher punishment than I am based solely on the criminal record. And
Absolutely,
the FBI.
yeah. That makes total sense. I'm just agreeing with you. That totally makes sense. So if we actually want to look at, statistics correctly, we'd have to correct for what you're talking about. We'd have to only look at first-time offenders and see if there was a discrepancy.
I don't think that happens because I don't think anybody really wants to see it.
Well, and from the larger perspective, that that's why I always try to introduce the multiple truth hypothesis, is truth means different things according to the framing. So if you say the larger context is group conflict of interest and larger cultural wars, where the different way that culture is structured, benefiting different groups in different ways, hence causing group conflict, and then truth being, what's good for my group is good for me, and the truth is instrumental towards seeing that your side wins, or some sort of objective analysis of trying to determine what is factually the truth. But what's factually the truth might negate, such a concept that there is conflicting group interest, and there's winners and losers. And for the larger cultural battle, like George Floyd or any of these various things, is saying like it's not about the truth of the situation. It's about the larger cultural war. And largely, yeah, it's a cultural war, and people are going to use any tool, any weapon at their disposal on both sides in order to win. And like you'd rather win with just the pure thought and logic, But if pure thought and logic doesn't work, there is logic to doing what it takes to win, and then I would try to keep that greater perspective analysis of larger struggles, larger conflict, larger framing, and then actually what is the truth and what does the truth matter to resolving these greater conflicts.
Yeah, well, the masses always respond based off of usually emotional appeals, which is, that's what propaganda does. It appeals to base emotions. So unfortunately, the objective analysis and presentation of facts is never really going to have as massive of response, at least initially, than just emotional hyperboles, basically.
Well, even say it's not even without the emotion, but just say the group conflict of interest in the culture wars will persist regardless of the facts, because the way cultural and society is set up will benefit different groups and ways of life unequally, and so there will always be these larger conflicts.
Are you, David, are you advocating for a more homogenous society with perhaps less of a representative republic or democratic system?
No, I mean, one thing, I would put it like a pure differential equations functions and say, no, I mean, group conflict would still exist even if groups would live separately. The equations might turn out differently if the group conflict is internally in multicultural societies or national between separate nations. There's still going to be a tendency for group conflict, and it doesn't just have to be ethnic nations. If you had ethnic homogenous nations, there would still be internal group conflicts, because there's going to be conflicts of interest, and it's not just different ethnicities or groups or races that set up ways of life that are more advantageous to them and disadvantageous to other people. You could have groups of the exact same race, ethnicity, families, tribes, that set up ways of life that are advantageous or disadvantageous enough to cause conflict that truth will be a casualty in the greater conflict.
What would you say is the best way to minimize that?
Well, I'm saying in essence, there is no way. It's the natural order. I mean, the same with limiting suffering, limiting conflict in general comes from a recognition of conflict of interest and the limiting of suffering. So the recognition that I want to limit my suffering, but the limitation of my suffering might cause an increase in someone else's suffering in some sort of compromise to a global state of reduced suffering. So, I mean, like me and Jennifer want to take a mathematical approach, but it's saying if I could have a localized state of really low suffering, but the majority of my surrounding is at a substantially higher state of suffering, the laws of entropy will necessitate that it's unlikely I'm going to be able to maintain, or impossible I'm going to be able to maintain, my localized state of minimized suffering. And it's kind of like utilitarianism in general. But yeah, these greater compromises will include the recognition that yes, occasionally I have to accept an increase in my own suffering to reduce the global state of suffering.
Can I make another point that circles back to the point about defunding the police? Most people do not believe in defunding the police totally. I believe that a lot of people would actually support reducing the amount of funds that police departments across the nation receive after we achieve a more libertarian system where substances, prostitution, all these things are either decriminalized or legalized and then regulated. We would then have billions of tax dollars from these currently illegal products and services, and then the police would not need as much money to go after these victimless crimes. And furthermore, when you have fewer things that people can attack you for or accuse you of doing, society as a whole tends to become a little more peaceful.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's truth to the idea that some stuff, you can't really get rid of it. Like, if you can't stop stuff from happening in jail, like prostitution and drug dealing, you're never going to stop it in the greater society. And the fact that people think that they can is sort of indicative to me of like a great deal of immaturity. And I would say, I would go as far as to
symbolic
say
of
that
suffering in general.
I would go as
Yes,
far as to say that they're intentionally misleading people, because if drugs are illegal, it's easier for organized crime to get a monopoly on drugs, which is what funds, politicians. So they want drugs illegal because they want to. It's easier for the monopoly. Same with prostitution. They don't want to have to be They don't want to have to be accountable to government standards, basically.
The CIA is the largest trafficker of cocaine into the country.
Yeah, I think what me and Jennifer are trying to do, and I'm not sure if Howie and Cisco, how mathematical your approach to it is, saying the variable we're going to be working with is probably best classified as suffering. And so we're looking at a reduction overall in suffering in the terms of these political arguments of like the police. So when you say like, yeah, you're never going to have no suffering. And that's the essential variable, and the outcome comes because you can't expect to have no suffering. You can't expect to have no crimes, and therefore you have to have police. And of all these various things, like you have to wear a mask and all these elements, it's like you can't expect that there's going to be no suffering, and suffering needs to be reduced, and people have to comply to certain measures of modified behavior in order to reduce the overall global state of suffering that could apply to police or really any form of governments or rules in general.
Well, I would say going back to that idea of decriminalize, legalize, and regulate, once you do that, you would have cut down quite a bit of suffering. About last I checked, it was 25% of people in prison in the United States are there for
Yeah, but how we
nonviolent
think about it,
crimes.
it's decreased to having all those people in jail is decreasing the suffering of the jail owner because he's really rich now. Think about that, Howie. That's how you need to look at it, because really that's what matters, because your karma is measured entirely by how much money you have. So by incarcerating all these people for nonviolent offenses, the prison owners are actually improving the world's karma by diminishing their own suffering and making tons of money and then lording it over other people. Right, Doovid?
Well, they're
No, because
decreasing
the
their own
general
suffering.
public has to pay to keep those people in prison. So I'm saying, like, the money for the private prison owners maybe, but overall societally, the taxpayers have to foot the bill to pay the private prison
Yeah, and
owners.
they're giving him a bunch of money, which is improving his karma, which is great. So it's a perfect
Yeah,
system.
but his karma is coming at the expense of the taxpayers and
Oh,
the
no,
people
that
who are
doesn't
in the
matter. That
prison
doesn't
system.
No,
matter.
it does,
That
because
doesn't matter at all,
where
right?
the flow of the money actually makes a big difference. So it's saying, if you're looking at it from Howie's perspective, yes, the reason we're tough on crime and the reason we send people to prison is to reduce suffering, because crime causes a substantial amount of suffering to all of society. So even the few people who cause crime, if we lock them away and treat them very harshly, even though that substantially increases the amount of suffering of those people in prison, that the amount of suffering overall still goes down, because the amount of suffering caused by those people in general society outweighs their own suffering in
Even
prison.
nonviolent offenders?
Well, I mean, the karmatic equation can conceivably be worked out for anything, even for
So
someone.
it's just like whatever you want, you just say it, and it's true magically.
No. I mean, it'd be mathematical, like a question of suffering, and saying like eventually.
But you can't
you'll have
establish that having somebody smoking pot is going to cause an increase of suffering for anybody.
I'm talking more theoretical than you want to give the examples, but yes, theoretically, all of these things could be and should be a derivative of some sort of function of reduced suffering. I mean, it may not pay to argue through all of them, but I mean, the example of the person going to prison, so the populace is paying the private prison contractor to keep this person away from the rest of us. The money, it has nothing to do with the person himself, the criminal, God forbid. The money goes directly from the general populace to the private prisoner, to the private prison owner who performs the function of keeping that person away from the rest of us. So the money karmatically does match the function that's being performed, and also a reduction of suffering. That, God forbid, evil could only be defeated by evil. So it's the same mechanism of a controlled evil mechanism to defeat an uncontrolled evil mechanism. The executioner is a controlled mechanism of evil, as where the criminal is an uncontrolled mechanism of evil. So you have a lower state of suffering to have a controlled mechanism of evil to deal with the circumstances when come up that you have uncontrolled mechanisms of evil.
I would also add that our prison system, back to what I was saying and getting off of that semi-tangent that kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. The prison system definitely needs reform. We are a scientific civilization. We pride ourselves on our advancements. We pride ourselves on our advancements, even if it's only a perceptional thing. We claim that we follow science. So why do we not follow science? And we go to this medieval Quaker, actually, system of justice, instead of using our scientific knowledge to reform criminals.
Because
who
the
claims
people
that
in
we
charge
follow
fucking
science?
hate you. The people in charge fucking hate normal people, and they see them as cattle, and they don't care about making their lives shit. They would be happier if you're miserable, because then you'll be weak and you can't oppose them. That's all they care about, is
Yeah, but
getting
you
as
didn't
much
follow the
money and
proper.
power as they can.
He didn't follow any proper logic. And he's like, we follow science. It's like, no, we follow the law, and the law does not quote science as one of the foundations for it. So, I mean, where do you get this we follow science? Maybe you have your own personal choice of how you perceive the world and try to form truth, follow
Well,
science.
that's the narrative, because the American schools are considered the best in the world. So the implication there is that they have the greatest mastery of science. That's a narrative. It's not explicitly said because, like you say, Doovid, it's not true.
Like I was saying, even if it's only perceptional.
Well, I mean, you don't follow science. You follow the law, and the law is not based on science.
Maybe it should be.
Yeah, obviously. Then there'd actually be reasonable answers to these questions rather than just nonsense.
But Bill Nye should not be in charge of what is being science.
Ethics and morals, because if the law was based on science, we wouldn't. You can't legislate. We basically legislate forms of morals and ethics, and generally science is counter morals and ethics. And you'd have things like efficiency, and if you followed science, God forbid, you get things like eugenics and Holocaust and genocides and various things, because you just have, well, like how we say, well, instead of throwing in prison, let's reduce suffering just by killing everybody. If God forbid everybody's dead, suffering goes to zero.
That's a false logic, though, because of reincarnation, right? That's obvious. That's like what JF said, right? That's a total cop-out.
Science is just a tool, and I would argue that morality itself is also just a tool to achieve an end goal, whereas science is a tool to figure things out.
Well,
morality
science is a
tool
way to
achieve
calibrate.
an end.
Science is a way to calibrate assertions, right? So if you say, I want to minimize suffering, and then you just say, well, I'm minimizing suffering and I'm just going to make up some rationalization, solipsism to justify what I've already come to a conclusion for, that's not really minimizing suffering. Whereas if you invoke science, you can argue and say, well, this diminishes suffering more than this, and therefore we should do this. And then you can actually, I don't see why there has to be no way to reconcile science and ethics. Science is just about getting closer and closer to a goal. And if we agree that the goal is minimizing suffering, then we can bring it very easily into a scientific domain and say,
minimizing suffering is an unscientific claim. So if you just say, I
no,
want
it's
to use
not.
science, except for this one unscientific postulate that I want to minimize suffering.
Why is it unscientific? Why is minimizing suffering an unscientific proposition?
Because there's no way to derive empirically that it's a good thing to have lower suffering than high suffering.
Well, who's going to disagree with it aside some crazy people whose opinions frankly don't matter?
I'm saying that's what JF
But
said.
I'm saying a reasonable person's not going to disagree that minimizing suffering is the supreme good. A reasonable person will agree with that because everybody can relate to suffering being bad.
That people maybe universally prefer to minimize suffering, but it doesn't mean that scientifically there's any way to derive that it's better to be in a state of lower suffering than higher suffering.
Well, science has shown that poverty actually reduces the intellect of an individual who suffers within poverty. And when you have a large number of people who are having their intellects reduced, that actually causes damage to society at large. So that is actually a scientific proof that suffering is a negative.
I don't think you can prove. You can't prove that suffering is bad. Suffering is bad as an axiom. Yeah, because good and bad involves the existence of some type of rubric of evaluation, some type of hierarchical ideology, and the universe is bereft of such an ideology. So you have to take it as an axiom that you want to minimize suffering. Now, not everybody has that axiom. A lot of people have the axiom of they just want to enrich themselves, and everybody else can go fuck themselves. So that's just two different approaches with different axioms.
No, I mean, you say there's both those people have the same axiom of minimizing suffering. The first person, the person is just, I only care about minimizing my own suffering, not the global state of suffering, but both have the goal of minimizing suffering.
Well, they can make that claim, but they can't necessarily establish that that's what they're doing. So are you agreeing?
We'll say that there's a natural law that no one wants to increase their own suffering. And even though Doooovid is arguing that scientifically you can't argue that not suffering is that suffering, so to say, is bad, or even that there's some scientific reason why you would desire to reduce suffering, that there's no scientific reason to expect that there should be reason to reduce suffering. It's just like scientifically we measure things. So there's a dead body and a live body. Is it good that the body's dead or alive? That's not a matter for science to tell you. Science will just tell you the difference between alive and a dead body, and maybe suffering is something could be measured. That's like how much pain and discomfort is this person in, and science could give a measurement of it. But to say, oh, it's bad that this person is in a state of whatever this means to be in suffering is beyond the realm of science.
I agree with you. That's why you have to assert off the top. You say my axiom is I want to minimize suffering, and then you can approach
that a non-scientific axiom into science.
Let me finish here, Doooovid.
Axiom into science, it would be so great. Yeah, of course.
But let me finish here. Then you can answer. So what you haven't established that it's not scientific, it's an assertion. Then you can treat that assertion scientifically, which is what you don't want, because it's going to disprove a lot of the things that you say, right? So that's what it is. It's an axiom. Morality, you can argue, is arbitrary. And then if you want to prove one moral system better than another, you need a standard of proof. And people aren't necessarily going to agree on that. But you can certainly take an axiom, which is minimizing suffering is morally good, and then test that and find what will minimize suffering using science. There's absolutely no reason why you can't do that. I do it all the time.
Can I state my take on this? my axiom would be that progression, scientific and technological progression of a civilization is a positive.
That's a
And
stupid axiom, right? That's like
but in
no
order
one's going to
to
agree with
make
that axiom.
in order to make that happen, you need to reduce suffering. See, an axiom like that has requisites and prerequisites. You can't have a civilization progress scientifically while 90% of the civilization is suffering and unable to even participate in the process.
Europeans advanced science tremendously, while the majority of them were suffering horribly. I mean, the Europeans got better at science as they were more and more religiously oppressed, because their imaginations had no home other than science, because they couldn't express it religiously anymore like they used to. So there's a trade-off there
Yeah, and you
between
could even
protected
argue that
advancement and
the most
religion and suffering.
yeah, you could even argue that the highest point of scientific advancement was actually the highest point of suffering during the war. That the most highest form of technological and scientific advancement came in the midst of the most death and murder, and that was actually the precipice for those advancements in science was this increase in suffering.
Yeah,
And so to
definitely.
argue, if
Well,
you want to increase scientific knowledge, actually you should increase suffering.
I mean, the scientific revolution took place during the Renaissance, which was after religious laws had been repealed. And most
Yeah, but there was no cultural, they didn't return to paganism, right? Like, there's a need in the heart of the
some of them
European
did.
soul to be part of a religion like that, and it wasn't fulfilled, and it didn't get any more fulfilled post-Renaissance. They just went into science and were able to get better results from science because they didn't have any home for their spiritual inclinations that would have been practiced ancestrally. Like, these things were massively persecuted, and in a way they still are. Like, look how much I get ridiculed for stating the simple fact of reincarnation. Like, anybody who's pro-science shouldn't be allowed to deny reincarnation because it's a conservation of energy thing. Yet it still happens because there's still this residual oppression. But that oppression is what led to the scientific developments as well as the advancements in warcraft. That's why Europeans were so much able to kill so many
Atheism is itself
people.
a religion.
Sorry?
Or at least atheism is itself a religious structure.
Well, it
can't.
functions, any ideology functions theocratically, so there's no doubt about that, but there's not like there's an atheist church, right?
Well, no, but there is an orthodoxy.
Yeah, definitely there's an orthodoxy, and it doesn't allow any path to traditional spiritualism. It's just another dead end.
It also doesn't allow questioning.
Oh, of course not.
If you question the theory of evolution, you will actually be dogpiled.
Yeah, you can literally profile, like, you can literally tell what theories are fake because historically they all have the same profile. Promoted by one Yahoo, persecuted anybody who went against it, and eventually just took over the entire discipline and censored everybody else through peer review process. You can see this with evolution, you can see this with general relativity, and you can see this with a lot of other things. It's really funny, actually. Just have to go into history.
All right, I'm going to eat pizza. I'm getting out of here.
Thanks for joining.
Lucky.
We really appreciated you coming on, and best of luck with your future endeavors. And we'll hope to have you on the show before long. Take care, Michael.
All right, thank you. Bye bye.
Yeah, great night. Nice talking to you again.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that pagan ancestors smoked weed all the time, right? And drank a whole bunch. I mean, that was just
And had orgies and took mushrooms.
see
did
again,
all this
I don't
crazy-
know about the sexual depravity, how much that's misconstructions by lying pieces of shit, or how much that was actually going on. I imagine that was not really the centerpiece, because it does appear that, like, when there's this like public displays of sexual degeneracy, that's sort of a sign that an empire is about to implode. Like, you kind of saw it in Rome and stuff. So I mean, I'll agree with you that, yeah, we have literal like cannabinoid receptors. We have cannabinoid receptors in our brains. Many pagan religions smoke marijuana as a religious ceremony. So making it illegal, in my view, is like religious persecution, which is like horrible amounts of
Well, you
untold
tried
amounts
to,
of suffering.
from the more mathematical model of saying you could have localized areas that are different and still have the larger conservation. So on a level, as long as productivity is high and you have more leisure, it's possible you could sustain higher levels of sin and debauchery than normal, as long as productivity is high and the level of higher sustained sin doesn't destroy the productivity, just like here during coronavirus. So it's like,
In
oh, it's like productivity is high, like nobody's starving, like we're in lockdown, society's changing, but there's not the cataclysmic starving or basic necessities that people are lacking that would cause
in Sumer, they restricted the usage of temple prostitutes to holy high days, and in a lot of less developed cultures that were pagan, they did have orgies with the entire community, but it was only on certain religious holidays.
You're saying that from your past lives when you participated in these things? You're saying because you read in a book or archaeological evidence?
I'm saying from my research.
Not from your past lives.
No, I don't claim to have any memories of past lives or anything like that.
Right. So how did you validate this research?
A lot of anthropological studies.
Well, you understand that the anthropologists are basically paid by big education to slander Hinduism, right? And to make it look as bad as possible. And this has been going on for like a long time. So why would you believe anything that they said? I don't.
All of academia has this anti-theistic slant.
I wouldn't go that far. I would say there's actually a very, 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 very pro-theistic slant, which is why you get stuff like Big Bang making its way into mainstream consciousness. That's a religious concept. That's not a secular concept. It was a priest, it was a Jesuit priest who first came up with mathematical formalism for that.
I was unaware of that.
Yeah, it's an important angle to look at. Very important, because there's a lot of stuff out there that's just not based on anything that can be validated. It's just like with evolution, right? Like if you write something that goes against the evolution model, you just won't be published in those journals, right? Because they have their axioms, so you can't go against the axioms. They're just not interested. They're only interested in things that reaffirm their narrative, which is, based on the profile, obviously not the correct answer. I mean, evolution's obviously natural selection. Evolution's obviously incorrect. You can poke so many holes in it; it's laughable.
Oh yeah, I have actually seen some papers that have been published that actually present evidence against evolution, but they come up with these hypotheses, and they posit these hypotheses as fact that explain these holes in the theory.
Do you have anything handy? Like, what do you know? What outfit is publishing these papers?
It's been a while since I even debated this, but
because like I don't follow it very much, because I don't agree with the axioms. Like I felt this way since I was in university and went to biology class, and I remember being like, is that seriously all that we're doing? Like we're just looking at this through the lens of this fake evolution thing? I remember sleeping through class.
Yeah, I don't pay too much attention to it, but
that's largely why I didn't become a doctor. I mean, I was pre-med, like I was basically setting myself up to become a doctor.
Oh my God, you didn't become a doctor because of natural selection?
Because of evolution. I mean, basically, like, that's my story. It was my hatred and despisal of being taught under evolutionary science that I chose not to become a doctor. Against my initial plans.
The last time that I debated this, I was taking the stance that evolution was false, and I was poking holes in it. And one of the points that I remember off the top of my head was carbon-14, because carbon-14 has a half-life of 10,000 years, which means that in 100,000 years there should be no carbon-14 left at all. There shouldn't be any left on the planet at all. And
well, it's constantly being regenerated in the upper atmosphere, right, through a reaction between sunlight gamma rays and nitrogen, I believe. It's
something
constantly
like that.
but
that only explains the carbon-14 in the atmosphere and on the surface level. When you're getting carbon-14 in fossils that have been buried for millions of years, there shouldn't be any carbon-14 left. But
so you're saying that they're finding carbon-14 in these ancient species. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. And when I last debated this, I was given an article about how it didn't have any evidence, but it proposed that there was a process by which carbon-14 replenishes itself even deep in buried fossils.
That's hilarious.
But they posit hypotheses as fact to support their hypothesis.
Well, that's how natural selection has always worked. I mean, if you look at a map of the, like, what they call the tree of life, I mean, it's obviously not. I mean, you've got something called punctuated equilibrium, right? Where you don't have any change in the morphology for a really long time, and then you get a huge divergence over a short period of time, like that. It's called macroevolution. Natural selection does not predict macroevolution. It actually contradicts it. And it's just sort of mind-boggling. And if you talk to these people, they'll say, oh, we just haven't found the missing species yet. They're still holding on to this idea that there's missing species. That this is like, and again, we come back to this idea that it's like religion tier denial. And what do you call it? Like a sort of when you're hand waving a complex problem because you don't want to acknowledge its complexity, so you just hand wave it and say, "Oh, well, we just haven't found them yet. Well, we'll find them eventually."
It's like this claim that only 1% of species end up fossilized. And where do we get that number from? We would have to have a record of all species that have ever existed in order to know that only 1% of them have been fossilized.
Yeah, that just sounds like an estimation to me, like a sort of pulled out of nowhere, one number's as good as the other type of thing. Because yeah, how could they possibly know? And that's another thing with this carbon-14 dating. I mean, there's a lot of problems with that just on the level of the assumptions. Because like, who's to say that the sun's always putting out the same amount of radiation to create this carbon-14, and slash the fact that all these ancient species have carbon-14 in them, which is, I mean, it could be contamination. It's hard to say, but I've got a diagram of the tree of life here up on my screen. And as you can see, it's all punctuated equilibrium. It's all punctuated equilibrium. It's like no change for a super long time, and then boom, divergence. You get a branch point, and then no change for a long time, divergence. So this is not at all predicted by natural selection. Natural selection says it should be slow and gradual, and that's it. And then they say, well, they add up over time, and then there's a big transition, but they don't offer a mechanism for it. So really, whether it's a religious, what's the word? If you have a religious objection or a scientific objection, this theory is obviously not a complete theory.
Scientific tests with tsetse flies that only live for a couple of days have been going on for 30 years now, and they've found many mutations, but never has there been a fly or a family of flies that have become genetically different from the species.
Yeah, and they can't establish that is happening because of the mechanism that they're claiming, because they're claiming that it's random mutation happening on the genetic level, and I'm saying no, it's happening on the level of the quantum mind, where the information is shifting around, and the selection of what traits are expressed is depending on the environment, and the DNA is like the intermediary, and it can change based on environmental changes. I mean, that's why you get stuff like Europeans having lighter skin because they're living in a climate for a long period of time that just doesn't have as much sun. Hello? Doovid, I don't think I can carry this show by myself. You're
Yeah, I was
go
waiting
ahead.
for Doovid to jump in because I kind of don't have anything else to add right now.
Doovid's muted. I don't know if you're talking there, but you're muted, Doovid.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we don't have to go forever. I didn't have that much exciting to talk about. I mean, you can always just banting or sharpening our minds.
I did actually want to talk about spirituality. That was what convinced me to come on today.
Spirituality is a pretty big topic.
Yeah, but it's a nice one to talk about. That's kind of relaxing to me, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, what do you mean? I mean, saying, what does it mean? I mean, talk about spirituality. You got to narrow it down from talk about spirituality. I mean, like we always talk about spirituality.
Well, earlier, when the stream first started, you guys were talking about these chants and spirituality, and I brought up Kabbalah in the chat. How Kabbalah and Hinduism have very similar practice of chanting the holy names in order to achieve an altered state of consciousness.
Well, I'm not sure about that. That the purpose, I mean, either one would say the purpose is to achieve altered state of consciousness. I'm saying if you're taking a believer pattern, chanting is a form of science. It doesn't alter our consciousness, it alters reality through a science. So if you're looking at it from like a spiritual perspective, like you're saying, I'm not sure about the science or whatever, but I know it alters me, that when I chant, I have an experience that I can't explain, versus someone who, so to say, has mastered the science of mantra and says like, no, I can tell you exactly what's happening and what you're experiencing, what the effect is, because they've studied the science of mantra.
Well, in my understanding of it, I don't subscribe to any particular path or ideology when it comes to spirituality, but chanting, especially chanting holy names, is a tool to, what's the word? Damn.
Calibrate.
Calibrate, enact a state of altered consciousness on the person doing the chanting or those who are around hearing it. And in that altered state, different things can happen, and that would be up for debate. But
yeah, I don't like the kind. I mean, to me, altered state is a problematic phrase. I mean, if you're purposely using that for some reason, if you want to say purified state, or just purely like scientifically that mantras in theory could be good or bad. So it could be an altered state that a person could use a mantra for bad. But like, no, I think altered state, that's like, people do drugs and get altered states. Like people do mantras and have their mind purified.
Well, yeah, and a purified mind is also an altered state. An altered state doesn't have to just be intoxication. Trance is an altered state. When you're meditating, when you are doing the full lotus and meditating, you are entering
the altered state
state.
Problematic because you're saying what's normal state. If something's altered state, what's the normal state? You're saying the purpose of it is to take you from a normal state and transfer you to an alternative state.
Well, from a neuroanatomical
There's when people watching, like, I don't like the terminology altered state. Like, I wouldn't use the terminology, and even for me to speak about it in that terminology, I think it's problematic? I mean, what about you, Jennifer? I mean, you think altered state's a problematic terminology, or that's yeah, that's
That's the correct term, because I mean, people could do mantra. It doesn't mean it's going to actually improve things for them if they have bad karma, if they're invoking deities that hate them or something like that. I mean, yeah, altered state is the correct term. It's just not. It doesn't have a negative connotation. It's just
from
neutral.
a neuroanatomical standpoint, we are in this state of mind where the default mode network is primary in our brains, and
Now
when
that doesn't, to me, that doesn't really make any sense. You're not defining what the default state is, and I think Doovid's question is a reasonable one, but it's not a question you could give a single answer to, because everybody has a different default state of mind, and that what your default is can change as you get older, right? You know, you get more mature, you're less anxious about certain things, so that could change. But generally, what you could say is that the mind is a quantum computer, and when you're not doing anything, the quantum computer tends to maximally saturate around your body. And in order to move it anywhere from its natural position, you have to exert effort. And the point of doing group chants is to synchronize various nodes of the quantum mind together so that essentially it's easier to think. And this is just something that happens naturally. Like if you look up these experiments with clocks, if you put them all in the same room, like the swinging clocks, the ticking ones, they'll eventually all tick at the same rate, and that's essentially a consequence of the law of entropy, that for them not to be going at the same rate would involve them doing work against each other, because the universe is wave-like and these waves are all interconnected to some extent. So that's basically what the point of group chanting is to share the burden of thinking, and to ideally bring your mind into a state of vibration that is better for you, and using the group as a sort of springboard for that end. I mean, that's the ideal, but that's not always how it happens, because you don't necessarily have the knowledge or the karma for such a thing to work for you.
Yeah, that's why I would prefer,
I was trying to explain it
other than altered state, because you're saying that, no, I mean, mantra is really a process of synchronization. And if you're, a group chanting is group synchronization, but even just a single person chanting, even if it's just a mental chanting, not even oral chant, is still a process of some sort of greater synchronization, and it may or may not actually alter the person's state. You say, okay, like I said a mantra, and that put me into synchronization with either some sort of greater force or greater harmony, and did that alter my state? Like, I don't know, and then also to say, okay, like Doovid's a weed smoker, but like generally, like, no, you don't have to like mind altering substances that are thought of in general, in saying the mantra could be considered mind altering, but it's more and beyond that. It's not just mind altering, and I'm trying to approach it from the possibility of the science of spirituality. We're saying, yes, in fact, mantras are scientific and exact that you could say that chanting certain mantras does in fact affect known spiritual changes, and that could be coupled by tune and time and place and location, and even caste, whether if it's a Brahmin who says a prayer in a temple in front of a deity at the right time, together with incenses and ritual ornaments, or just a private person meditating who says a mantra, or the time and location. And there's all these various effects that are going to, so to say, greater synchronization that is more than just an altered consciousness, because it's saying, like, yes, the level of synchronization is different if you just chant a mantra in your house versus if you chant it in a temple or in a holy site, versus if you chant it with a group of people, or possibly if you chant it versus with a person from a lineage, from a connected tradition, or all of these various things. And it goes far beyond just the state of that one given person's mind. that may or may not be being altered.
And I was trying to attack it from an anatomical perspective, and there is also the Jungian perspective that when you enter an altered state, it's not that these special things don't happen without the mantra. It's that with the mantra you notice them more. That would be the Jungian perspective. But from the anatomical perspective, an altered state would be anything that takes that causes your brain to send synapses outside of the default mode network, which is a set of 3 or 4 substructures in the brain that are pretty much constantly active while we are awake.
But they're not always active in the same way because the mind's a quantum computer. The mind it's not equal. The mind is not equal to the brain. So you have to get the right words there to express it, because the mantras are essentially means to calibrate the quantum mind. So it's like a bunch of vibrations, a bunch of nodes, a very complex system with 11 dimensions within it. And the idea with the mantras, like Om or something like that, is that you're actually targeting parts of the quantum mind to calibrate them so that they work better. But yeah, I think I can see why Doovid doesn't like altered, because it's sort of associated with drugs. But scientifically, that's the prudent label, because from a scientific perspective, what we can say is that something's changing. So it's a changed state. And then to go on top of that and say, well, it's a heightened state, that's a claim that has a higher burden of evidence. So just scientifically prudent, we want to just say what requires the least evidence to prove. And then if you want to prove further assertions, you can. But again, the burden of evidence is higher. Hello?
Yeah, but either way, if you like the general spirituality, whatever you're trying to accomplish, you want to say you're altering your state by chanting a mantra, is it's like spiritual system. So I mean, I don't like the word spirituality. To me, you want to phrase it more in a realm of like spirituality implies dualism, to a large extent, because you have spiritual realm and a physical realm. And so spirituality means I want to focus on the non-physical realm, at least from a classical definition. So when you say, I want to talk about spirituality, and so are you accepting the axiom of dualism when you state that, or are you saying like, no, I'm not interested in talking about dualism when I said I want to talk
I am interested in talking about dualism, because my system is fundamentally, at its very root, is a non-dualism. But from the non-dualism, all the other types of dualisms arise, right? So when we're talking about things on the level of like fundamental causality, there's a non-dualism. But then when you go to talk about something specific like psychology, which would be the realm of these altered states of consciousness, or like parapsychology, if you want to call it that, then you can introduce a dualism and say, well, the mind and the body, those are separate entities. Ultimately, the origin is the mind, if we trace it back far enough, so it is non-dual. But practically speaking, it makes sense to draw a dualism between the body and the mind, because that's where the clear line is, experientially speaking. Like it's an artificial dualism, but it's a very useful dualism, because without it, we can't do science of psychology.
Well, you're saying that spirituality is a misnomer, that if you're not a dualist, there is no such thing as spirituality, and you're rejecting.
Well, says you. A lot of people have called me an atheist, but I just say,
you're
just
an atheist,
rejecting.
when spirituality is a term of dualism. So spirituality, by definition, implies non-physical. So if you say there is no non-physical, there is no separate second spiritual realm separate from the physical realm. The whole concept of spirituality is an unneeded, unnecessary term. And if you're not a dualist, there's no reason for you to even use it.
Buddhism is non-dualistic, and electricity and radio waves are both non-material, but they are both very much part of our what we consider to be our material reality.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
the opposite. You say they're non-dualist because they're saying that it's the material realm that in fact doesn't exist. It's not the
No,
spiritual realm that
we're
doesn't
saying,
exist. It's the material realm
No,
that
it's
doesn't
what we're
exist.
saying, what I'm
both
saying
of
is
these
that
exist.
everything comes about from the material realm, including the spiritual realm, and the spiritual realm is just the same way we distinguish photons from mass. Like photons and mass are all energy, but we still make a distinction between them because we experience them drastically differently. It's the same with spiritualism and materialism.
And it could be said that, spirituality is an ever-present reality, but we don't normally notice it until we enter these altered states, which heighten our senses to it.
Sure, you could say that, but you still haven't addressed what Doovid's dilemma is. There is whether you're introducing a fundamental dualism on the level of an abstract spiritualism, or you're allowing the spiritualism to arise from the material.
Yeah,
Like,
what
do
does it
you-
mean? You want to talk about spirituality and saying, like, from my perspective, when you want to talk about spirituality, that's like code for you want to talk about dualism. You want to talk about non-physical phenomenon.
Yeah, I don't see it like that. When I when I hear people say they want to talk about spirituality, what I think they want to talk about are states of consciousness which are not the default position. So any form of consciousness that is outside of normal consciousness would be considered in the domain of spirituality. And it's just a question about, like, well, where does consciousness come from? Was the root of consciousness? Was the nature of consciousness? To me, those are the fundamental spiritual questions. And when people say, they want to talk about spirituality, what I really think they're saying is they want to talk about consciousness.
Well, I would say I want to talk about consciousness in the quantum conceptualization of it.
Cool. Yeah. So how do you understand quantum? What does that word mean to you?
Well, to me, quantum consciousness would be very closely tied to quantum computing.
Yeah, but just the word quantum. What do you think that means? If
Oh,
you want
well-
to take a break, if you want to take a break now, Doovid, I could probably talk about quantum with Howie for a little while. If you wanted to take a break, Doovid.
Okay, yeah, no problem, because I've heard Jennifer go through this like
Doovid's
10
heard this infinity
times.
times. I don't want to torture him by
Yeah, I mean,
saying
but with all of the lifetimes, I've heard this tens and tens of times a week in review, and if you add up all the previous lifetimes, millions of times.
Doovid, will you still remember this conversation in our next life when we're doing Week in Review Part 2? Week in Review Reincarnated?
I think the reality of the world may have molded to a different form that, yes, it will still be some sort of repeat in this, but it will be in a substantial different form that only someone who understands meta-analysis would be able to recognize it as the same thing.
Let's hope we can still rewatch our streams from our past lives and our future lives. Because, yeah, one of my greatest pleasures is rereading my books from my past life. So, yeah, Howie, back to this question, because, like, we got to get on the same page in terms of what we're even talking about. So when I say quantum, when I say quantum, it's not a trick question. I'm not trying to set you up to embarrass you, but when I say quantum,
You're trying to
what do
get
you?
my level of understanding.
I'm trying to see what you see when you think of the word quantum.
Well, when I think of the word quantum, I'm actually thinking of subatomic particles that are basically untraceable by our standard methodology. But that's not exactly what quantum physics is, but that's generally what I think of when I think of quantum physics.
Yeah, so when I say quantum, what I mean is that entities are quantized. So, for example, you can't have half a proton. You can only have a proton or no proton. You can't have half a proton. Do you understand what I mean? So in that sense, it's a quantized progression. So if I was going to create protons and I was graphing myself create protons, it would be a step by step. It would be a stair stepping function. You know what I mean by that? Where it's just like a line, and then it jumps to a new level, and then there's a line, then it jumps to a new level. It's like the elements on the periodic table are another perfect example of quantization. You have hydrogen, helium, nothing in between. And these elements are right beside each other on the periodic table, but they're completely different in so many ways, right? Like one is inert, one is very reactive, et cetera, et cetera. Quantized. So that's what quantum means. It means that the transitions between states are discrete. So you really have to learn to make a distinction between continuous and discrete transitions, right? So if I was going to walk, like if Howie and I were neighbors and I was going to walk to his house, that would be a continuous graph. I'm not trying to be condescending to you, Howie. I'm also doing this for the benefit of the audience if they're not familiar, because this distinction is extremely important. So when I say quantized, and when I say that the mind is quantized, what I'm saying is that there's no way to meaningfully subdivide your personality in two, right? So if Howie takes some drugs and becomes really high, he's still Howie. He's just a different harmonic of Howie, right? He can't literally divide himself in two and have the resulting two entities make sense. Do you agree with that analysis?
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's
I mean,
sensible.
I'm aware of this idea of like multiple personalities and, the twins who are like really the same person living in two different bodies. Like you can look at the twin studies, identical twins, there's whatever, like there are these like fringe cases where it's like, well, how does that work? It's like, well, some people just like their minds aren't working very good. It doesn't mean they literally have two personalities. They just have some sort of shock that caused them to, as a coping mechanism, basically create an alternate personality, that it's still just one, like their own mind contains both personalities, each of which would be indivisible and individually, right? So it doesn't really contradict it. But yeah, basically that's the idea with quantum. And then to understand the mind as the quantum computers, you want to think of it as, you start with the idea of like, do you know what an oscillator is?
Yes, I'm
So,
very familiar with oscillator.
so you've seen, like, it kind of looks like a skipping rope fixed at the ends vibrating. So it's like a line, and then it's like when you're strumming on a guitar and it goes up and down type thing. So that would be considered the first harmonic. And then if you had a note in the middle and then it was vibrating and there were two moving parts, then that would be the second harmonic, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that the mind is comprised of things which essentially function as oscillators. So there's like waves and stuff, but the whole mind as an entity is too difficult to really visualize, but you sort of visualize like a simplified version of it, and you take into account that it's very complex, and because it's your mind that's actually doing the estimation, there's no way for it to subsume itself into its own reasoning, right? Like you can't transcend your own mind because your mind is the source of its own computations.
Yeah.
Like it can't compute the computer in some sense. Like there is an amount of self-transcendence one can have, but there is probably always going to be something missing because the observer.
Can I rephrase what you're saying?
Yeah,
and
go
see
ahead.
if my rephrasing is accurate. So the mind arises from the brain. Right?
Not quite. No, not quite. They work in tandem as a pump. So the way to understand the pump is, you imagine a five-week-old fetus that doesn't have a heartbeat yet, and it's just hanging out. And then a quantum consciousness, which you can visualize as a sphere, comes over to the fetus because it's maximally coherent with its capacity. Like the fetus has an inert ability to create vibrations because our bodies can sustain our minds. So basically your mind is magnetically attracted to the future lifetime that is most consonant with your karma. So the idea is that each life you're more or less coming back to the same place you were in your previous life. It's like a magnetic synchronicity thing. So you basically all go. So what happens?
That's an idea I haven't heard before.
So what happens in terms of like the chicken and egg thing? So it's in there. Which is the chicken and which is the egg, really? Like which came first depends on where you start, but I think this is the most intuitive way to look at it. So you've got this inert fetus and you've got this quantum consciousness, and this quantum consciousness came from a previously died organism which lost its quantum mind. The quantum mind floated off, decayed, and then finally synchronized to a fetus. And then once the quantum, so it's like a pump, right? So you think of it as a sphere that gets a little bit smaller. And that, as it gets a little bit smaller, that's called waveform reduction. And then energy from the quantum mind is going into the body. So that's the first stroke of the pump. And then the body animates at that instant, and that's when the heartbeat starts. And as soon as the heartbeat starts, energy goes back into the mind. Mind tells the body how to act, body sends energy to the mind, and that's where you're, it's like a pump. So you could call it a causal pump, but day to day, the more accurate, like, so does the mind create the body or the body create the mind? I think the accurate way to describe it would be to say that the mind ultimately chooses the body and then deforms it along its karmas. But day to day, the body sustains the mind, and the mind ultimately drives the changes in the body. Because obviously, like, if you want to, exercise, that's your body, or sorry, that's your mind driving you to move your body, right? So I guess you could call it like a cyclic co-creation kind of thing. But ultimately, if you go back to the very beginning, it's the mind. The mind is what put that initial spark. And life to life, it's the mind that puts the initial spark into the fetus. And then from there on, it just continues as a pump.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But that's
Thank God.
That's not
Thank God,
that's not
Howie.
actually what I've heard before.
Well, a lot of people are fucking confused, but the fact that you can follow that train of logic gives me tremendous hope for mankind, because if you couldn't follow it, Howie, and if nobody can understand what I'm saying, then what good is any of this stuff?
So my conceptualization back pre 2017, that's when I started really getting into the wave theory of quantum physics. Back before then, my conceptualization of consciousness was you have particles, and those particles are capable of processing information, and they are constantly processing information even when we aren't using them for that. And uh, the processing of the information is actually itself very complex.
Oh, but that's just a hand-waving excuse given by crap quality scientists and religious frauds, because there is no such thing as irreducible complexity. There's only varying qualities of scientists. So for the people who are in the audience, they can have a look at my chakra diagram, which shows very clearly how the light field, aka quantum consciousness, folds into the body. So Howie, I don't know if you can see this, but if you pull up the stream, you'll be able to see the image. I don't know if you've seen it yet. It's the chakra diagram, but basically you're starting at a sphere, okay? Because photons, which is what comprise the consciousness, photons want to be in a sphere because it's the maximum entropy state, because the sphere's maximum entropy state because it minimizes the torque about the center of mass. So it's basically the most symmetrical object that you can have. But because all the energy will be saturated at the perimeter, that increases the probability of a electrical discharge along the boundary, which would be potentially dangerous for a life form. So the light will fold itself in such a way, which is the law of electricity, as to minimize the potential for a discharge of electricity along the boundary. And this discharge of electricity can actually be demonstrated. It's very interesting. I don't know if I have the GIF, but I'll pull it up if I do. Can actually be demonstrated to be happening during the process of cell division. So what happens in cell division? Well, I can actually tell you, rather than hand waving with some, oh, we don't know because it's too mysterious and blah, blah, blah. I can actually point to it step by step and tell you what's happening. So I'm going to try to pull up my GIF that I have here real quick, because it is quite nice. And I'll talk you through it step by step. So here what we have is a normal cell. And what happens? Well, its quantum mind goes out of its default position, right? So rather than being spherical, it elongates for the purposes of duplication, and it gets so long that its length allows for an electrical discharge, because electrical discharge is all about distribution of energy. So when you have an asymmetrical distribution of energy, you're increasing the probability of a net discharge. So what's the cell doing? It's forcing itself into a distended position, snapping apart. There's your discharge, electrical discharge, and poof, you get two new cells out of it. So yeah, I do think it's extremely useful, but it does take a bit of time to get used to the words, which is why I wanted to spend time just going over the idea of what a quantum is, because even though like simple things like protons, electrons are quantized, and we can kind of understand what that means, it takes a while to get more familiar with the mind as a quantum entity because it's so complex. Slash, it's our reference point, right? Like we are all making all of our judgments here starting from the reference point of subjective consciousness.
What are your thoughts on the oversoul?
What is it? The what?
The oversoul? Basically, it's a concept that I'm not entirely sure how I would even start to relate it to quantum physics, but it's a concept that there is a larger soul that separates into smaller pieces, and those smaller pieces, still connected to the larger soul, make up the life forms on Earth. Like you and Doovid and I might be part of the same oversoul.
Yep, that's what you would call a axiomatic preference. So one of the laws of quantum mechanics is that the quantum waveform is indivisible. It has no hidden variables. Everything is explained by the quantum waveform. So if you choose to look at things from the perspective of the total quantum waveform of the planet, then you can define this concept like the supersoul. You can do that because then you can say, okay, we're just like little fruits plucked from the tree of the supersoul, right? And because we are all, carbon-based life forms, and we all experience consciousness. I don't want to say we experience consciousness in the same way, but the mechanism that drives our consciousness is the same for humans and animals. Like ultimately, it's a waveform that is a way to store energy. Basically, it's how the energy of the sun finds its equilibrium. So there's not like a different, there's not like a silicone-based life form where we can't be sure if it experiences suffering in the same way that we do. No, we can be reasonably certain that we have a shared root of consciousness because we have this shared biology in DNA. But yeah, like what you're describing would come under the purview of a different school of philosophy, right? So if I want to approach the problem as a psychologist, then it would make sense for me to look at people as individuals. But then if I want to approach the problem as a religious reformer, it may make more sense to look at people as, like I said, fruits plucked off the tree of the supersoul, right? So can you see how it's a difference in aesthetic preference? It's not a difference in truth value, because a quantum approach allows both of those formalisms.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I didn't bother thinking about it like that.
Well, it's I'm sure in some sense it's new, right? It's something that you've never been initiated to before, so you've been fascinated about these things. But I mean, traditionally speaking, you do need a master to sort of yoke your understanding to a higher level. So I'm just really glad that you're open to this stuff, because I think once you can get a basic understanding of the basic physics of it, it makes these other things a lot more useful. Like taking psychedelics, for example, what that's doing is inhibiting certain nodes of your consciousness and funneling more energy into other nodes, which is why you are able to see things with more color than normal, right? For example. Because that's literally what's happening. Your mind is being, quote, calibrated. Another generic term, like altered. Calibrated can be, usually there's a positive context with calibration, but basically it's like imposing a change on the state of the system. And yeah, that's my theory as to how psychedelics work, is that they inhibit certain nodes and amplify others.
Yeah, they inhibit usually the default mode network, and they do cause more interconnectedness in the rest of the brain while inhibiting the basal state of consciousness.
Yeah, the way you want to think of it is your starting point is basic default position consciousness. and then you can step in a quantum manner from that state into other states. And your mind has like millions of different states that it could be in, and these drugs have predictable effects on certain subsets of the mind, right? Like, I guess you could think of one of the attributes of subjective consciousness to be a funneling. So all of our consciousness that would normally be a three-dimensional, going out in three dimensionals, is funneled down into approximately one dimension, right? Because you can really only focus your vision in one direction, right? Like you can try to sort of see whatever, but really it's one dimension. It's a collapsed thing, right? Like you understand that the subjectivity creates a funneling in that sense, which
Yeah, you can only
psychedelics.
focus.
The point I'm making is that psychedelics inhibit that funneling, and that's why on mushrooms it feels like almost like your field of view is bigger. I don't know if that's a good description, but it's inhibiting the funneling of the consciousness into a linear shape, which is obviously the goods. It's good to have it in a line because then you can focus on individual things. But then I guess some people like to get fucked up, right?
In normal consciousness, you can only really focus on one or two things at a time, and three things would really be stretching your focus to its extent. And psychedelics, they really broaden your focus. They make it impossible to focus on one thing at a time.
Yeah, like I don't know if you've ever done DMT, and I
Not yet.
don't have direct experience with it, but I've read a lot of testimony of people who have, and what it sounds like is it's almost capable of fully inhibiting the subjective funnel. So people are literally experiencing non-subjectivized consciousness, and that's why you get these crazy stories of people like I don't exactly remember how they describe them, but you can look them up yourselves. People
Oh yeah,
have,
with DMT, there's a lot of stories about going into another world and meeting the creatures that live there. And one interesting thing about that is that the descriptions that people give over time is seemingly suggests that these entities in that other world are real and have their own lives that they live and go about their day.
Quantum consciousness isn't restricted to animate matter, because when animate matter dies, quantum consciousness doesn't. And that consciousness isn't necessarily going to reincarnate right away. So it's just there, right? And we don't tend to perceive it day to day because perceiving things other than our immediate environment would be deleterious as an animal, right? Like if you the reason we think the reason we experience consciousness the way that we do is because any other way of experience it would have led to our death, right? Like if we experience non-localized consciousness all the time, we wouldn't be able to tell the difference between ourselves and other people. Which you can imagine would be very dangerous, right?
Have you heard
We're living in a society.
Are you familiar with stoned ape theory?
Yeah, I think it's basically true, and I think the strongest evidence in support of it is the fact that our brains have literal cannabinoid receptors in them, which suggests a coevolution, right?
Yeah, stoned ape theory, McKenna put it best. Well, he didn't summarize it. He went at length about it multiple times, but he went about psilocybin mushrooms and how our ancestors would have been evolving right next to psilocybin mushrooms. And these mushrooms, they break down the sense of singular consciousness, and that's where the sense of oneness with everything comes from.
Oh yeah, I have a theory about that.
And
that.
he
So
also
Go ahead, finish what you were saying.
posited that while our ancient ancestors were tripping on psilocybin mushrooms, we were also having orgies.
Well, I don't know about that.
Well, I mean, it does make sense when you look at the structures of the human being
Okay.
and the way that that our psyches are.
Okay, if that's what people are into, whatever. I
But-
don't want to go into the orgies talk. I want to
Yeah.
stick to. I want to say, because it's an important point, right? Like I wanted to tell you my theory about it is basically like, you know how there's different animal kingdom or different kingdoms. There's animals, plants, fungus, etc. You know about that?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think they're basically ecological niches that all have different qualities of consciousness, and that the fungus has non-localized consciousness. And when you eat the fungus, it's sort of sharing its quality of consciousness with you. So you're not complete, like if you take magic mushrooms, you're not going to be completely like in DMT land. Like it's a different level, I believe, from what I've read. But you're going to start to break down those walls that are sort of there by default, right? And feel a more like you hear people say stuff like a oneness or a a connection or but essentially what it is instead of like you're having consciousness which is not 100% subjectivized, because the default position is 100% subjectivized consciousness. You're looking right in front of you and it's in a line and that's it. And these psychedelics allow you to experience a state of consciousness which is either adjacent to that state or semi-adjacent, i.e., it's less subjectivized. I prefer subjectivized rather than localized, because every living quantum consciousness is localized to itself, which is sort of tautological. But subjectivized implies that you have an actual ego, which is moderating the whole body, right? Like our consciousness is saturated in our brain. I think we can all agree on that. Even though it's technically distributed everywhere, and we can see that in the chakra diagram, we feel it most strongly because it has an energetic maximum inside the brain, and that's your criterion for subjectivized consciousness. In other words, the animal kingdom occupies the subjectivized consciousness realm, and the other kingdoms are non-subjectivized. So the consciousness isn't localized anywhere; it's spread out amongst the entire fungal matrix. The mycelium overmind is what I've called it.
Oh,
That's just my little pet theory.
I would also bring up astral projection, because despite astral projection lending credence to the notion of a non-localized consciousness, it is still very subjective.
Well, exactly. So this language allows us to describe something like astral projection in the language of quantum mechanics. So we can say that rather than being localized to the brain, the subjective consciousness becomes delocalized. And when people say they're astral projecting, what's happening is that this energetic maximum that's normally living in the brain has gone somewhere else. And there are many people that attest to this happening. It's certainly a well-documented thing. I mean, I think the best example is sleeping, because sleep happens because if you're awake all the time, your brain would basically become mush because your mind would electrocute it to death. So sleeping is your mind pulling the energetic maximum out of your brain and putting it probably like right in front of your face, a little bit further from its normal center, while the biological tissue repairs itself. So I think it's a really useful way of looking at things, because you're modeling the mind as a geometric object, which makes its mechanics a lot more easy to approach. Doovid, how's it going? I think I'm done my quantum rant. I hope that was
Doovid
beneficial.
looks very displeased with the discussion.
Yeah, I phased out completely. If I've been just watching something else.
He went into an altered state of consciousness. But yeah, like some people really don't like the altered states of consciousness because their ego is just too brittle. Because like they would feel like that their own ego or sense of self was being destroyed by the experience. So I don't promote psychedelic use generally. I think most people would be better off without it, and that if they are going to do it, they should do it. They should be safe about it, take precautions, and
do it with
be
a
sure.
good reason.
Yeah, intention. It always comes back to the importance.
Not just doing it to do it, not just doing it to have fun, but to do it to have new insights about the world or about themselves.
Yeah, I'm sure people who've had bad experiences.
Oh, I'm one of them.
I remember being at a house party once, and this girl, I didn't know her very well, and she's kind of a flake, but she took a bunch of mushrooms, and so did a bunch of other people there, and I was there with my buddy, and he's kind of like one of these stoic German types. Comes from a city where like he's related, or no, like not a city, sorry, a little town in Quebec where he's like related to like 95% of the population there, and he's super good looking. He's like a family friend. We were just like walking around, and we walk into this room, and this girl's there, and she looks over at him, and I guess she had a crush on him or something, and she just started screaming at the top of her lungs for like 5 seconds. So yeah.
Yeah, I always used to hear horror stories about people who would take LSD and they'd look at their friends and see their friend's face melting, and I'm just sitting here now having the experience and the knowledge that I do, going, that's what made you quit?
Well, it's a different perspective. I mean, it's ultimately whether you're a conscious scientist or not. Like, do you want to dive? Do you see something scary? And like, what's your reaction to something scary? Do you want to dive in and confront it, or do you want to just deny it? I think that's ultimately a philosophical branch point between people. Like, some people just love to fuck with their consciousness, and other people just. I think it's a question of ego development. Like, if your ego's not very well developed, you're not going to want to start fucking with your consciousness because you don't even really have a grasp on your consciousness in the first place.
That's a good point. Uh, Most of the people who struggle with not only psychedelics but with spiritual states of consciousness are not the most intelligent people. They are people who, uh, they struggle doing a quadratic equation.
Yeah, I think there's a connection there. Like, if it was me making the decisions, I would strongly discourage anybody without what I call a fully formed ego from doing these kinds of things. Because once you, like, before you have a fully formed ego, you know, if you're an NPC and you don't really know why you do the things that you do, it's just like a rote thing. Psychedelics are really going to potentially screw you up quite a bit. Like, imagine, you know, being an NPC and being high on drugs. Like, you can see why people get pretty terrified of it.
Yeah, it's like uh, when you take these substances, you realize a lot of very unpleasant truths about the world, and like war is pointless. War doesn't have a point aside from people want to fight war.
Yeah,
Or
the mushroom doesn't go to war. The mushroom's just chilling. And when the tree dies, the mushroom eats it and doesn't give a fuck, you know? War doesn't exist in mushroom land.
yeah, and but if you're not very intelligent and you are suddenly awoken to that fact that a lot of shit that humans do is for the sake of our own desire and no other reason, that I would imagine would be pretty terrifying.
Yeah, universal nihilism is not a pill the faint of heart can swallow. They need to have a strong footing on their own ego before, because like drugs is like you're fucking with your own consciousness, right? And if you don't even have any clue about your own consciousness and you start fucking with it, well, obviously it's going to be a recipe for disaster. So yeah, I'm trying to be scientific here, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm promoting the use of such substances. I'm promoting minimizing harm strategy and taking into account the historical precedents. And the fact is that evolutionarily speaking, we did grow up taking massive amounts of drugs, and possibly, probably doing at certain points doing the things Howie is alluding to. I don't know that they figured centrally into the culture all the time, but yeah, I'm sure orgies did happen.
Well, actually, one of the points that I disagree with McKenna on is actually that orgies are a good thing. McKenna proposed that because humans arose as an orgiastic species, that we need to break down monogamy in order to progress ourselves. And I can't agree with that. The evidence is against that.
Yeah, I agree. The evidence is definitely against that. It just seems a bit immature. I mean, I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine. I know it went on. I don't think it's any way to any higher states of consciousness or greater realizations about the universe. Group sex. I mean, it just seems disgusting.
Well, I mean, under certain contexts, I would say it could possibly be used for advancing an individual's consciousness. However, as a species, I don't think it's a good thing.
My guess is that the use of psychedelics was restricted to like a priest class type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you
Oh,
could say
and
it has a use in masonry and like a general cult craft, that it creates a certain state of karma that could only be created by that, and like a tribalism. But no, I mean, generally the energy is sinful, so you're not going to say good things come about it. But certainly there might be a certain karmatic attachment that's created by such a situation, and that could be useful for the state of cult craft. And historically there has been many cults that's the ritual of a certain initiation or certain pre-planned exercise. A lot of cult crafts will have rituals where you somewhat internally train, and then eventually will go out into the mass, and the ritual will be a preparation for an act that the people who participate in the ritual in private will eventually perform publicly among the masses. And karmatically, although almost always so to say negative, that would likely be increasing the state of suffering. There could be somewhat like a training ritual for certain exercises, say like that is in fact, even though you're perverted and largely in sin, the best training algorithm for certain things, and hence that's why it's done.
Well, this is how I would describe it. Like, the average person is not autonomous. They need to be told what to believe and basically what to think and what to do. So you have this like priest class who tells people what to think and what to believe. And the priest class functions better if they're all on the same page, and the drugs are a way to increase the consonance between the consciousness of the priest class. I mean, I think that would be sort of your like best case scenario description for what's going on. I just have to go for 1 minute. I will be right back.
And that would explain the practices as well. The orgies and psychedelics both break down subjective consciousness, at least temporarily. So when we see priests and elites engaging in these behaviors, that could actually be what they're doing. They're breaking down the subjectivity between each other so that they are more on the same page.
Well, I mean, the anthropologists, experts who discuss these type issues, so to say, initiation rituals that could appear questionable, and there's general themes among different cultures and different rituals that could include what you're talking about, or just general forms of enduring severe suffering for the sake of being initiated into a group membership. And it serves a function of just putting a high barrier of entry upon membership, that the membership is considered more valuable. And this, there's been considerable studies on that people consider membership in an organization more valuable when there's a higher barrier to entry. So the level of the people of, so to say, occult craft that participate in more extreme levels of ritual will create a stronger bond on certain levels, as per fact that they paid a higher price in terms of the barrier of entry of what they did to be members in that group. And, that could have effects in multiple ways in how you understand forms of perversion or violence or any of these different things. There's a general science, Freemasonry or cultcraft, however you describe it, that would generally be applicable to all cultures and all forms of initiations and rituals. And what you're talking about is not necessarily out of the realm of normalcy of what could be described within these rules of anthropology.
Yeah, like think about it. If two people in the priest class are quarreling, you just put them in a room with a big bag of mushrooms until they see past their differences. And then if somebody in the laity is getting uppity, you say, "Here, come take these mushrooms," and then you intimidate them and say, "No, you're not
You
able
force
to say
cooperation
better.
at some point.
You're
They're
not
all
able to say better." Well, sometimes people from the laity get crazy ideas and they need to be put in their place. So scaring the shit out of them on psychedelics might be a viable path.
any of these levels, from what Howie's talking about, like drugs or perversion or even violence or laws or normal mechanisms, are basically all forms of forced cooperation. I mean, the purpose of
Well, that's what
the
cultcraft
ritual,
is, isn't it?
yeah. I mean, obviously. So I'm saying when you formalize these things and try to mathematize it, you see, yeah, there's tons of different forms of forced cooperation that could apply or be more beneficial or problematic depending on the situation. And for whatever, Howie's got his favorite ones that he wants to talk about, and okay, that's fine, whatever the reason, but it doesn't mean that they don't that the same formulaic rules won't apply to even these obscure scenarios that Howie keeps on bringing up.
Yeah, that's I guess that sort of shows that cultcraft is the right word for it, because it's an art as well as a science, because there's an aesthetic element to it as well, right?
Yeah, and even nefarious versus benevolent, the structure of cultcraft could be largely the same between a nefarious and a benevolent organization.
Exactly.
That just brought something to mind, because something that is an art and a science is magic, at least as defined by Crowley.
We was magicians and shit.
We is.
Well, it could be the same thing that we talked about the other day, like that's just perceived by different people. So, like, in the lodge, magic is science because like your fellow brother, you could explain exactly how you do it, but on the street, it's magic because you want people to think that you have some special ability because they can't understand how you do these phenomena. But the phenomenon itself is the same whether you explain it to your brother in scientific terms or whether you do it for the masses in order to induce some sort of authority structure by your capabilities of doing things beyond their understanding. But the actual occurrence of what happened is the same regardless of the intention or the implications or the societal effects.
Yeah, it's kind of cool that we can converge to sort of a general theory of cultcraft. Like, I do think that's worth exploring because ultimately
You literally like a magician's meeting, like this week in review is just like that. It's just like a colloquium of magicians discussing tricks.
I like that.
There are good reasons why I rejected Thelema and did not become part of the religion.
Well, that's good. What were they?
Well, I mean, some of what Crowley did, some of what Crowley believed, but also mainly the just the doctrine. I don't like following any one doctrine. I like being able to move around and experiment.
I guess the way I see it is that ultimately every religion's driving towards one unified truth, and I actually like studying other religions, even if I feel like their understanding of truth isn't quite where mine is, because it yields its own truths, which is what Doovid is sort of alluding to with cult craft, because it's like the content of the ritual, the truth value of the content of the ritual is not the important information. The important information is the purpose that it serves in the community. Because there's a deeper truth where you don't even need to take into consideration the truth, whatever that may mean, of the ritual itself. And ultimately it goes to like government, because it's mind control, what people believe, crafting what people believe and what people do.
And then you got to get into the more complicated theological things like, like dualism, and it's like, what does it mean? Is there a separate spiritual realm where the performance of the ritual has some sort of connection that, no, this ritual is performed correctly, and therefore it has an effect in the spiritual realm that causes it to have, some sort of beyond normal material understanding effect that could only be explained? Or you're completely naturalistic and saying like, well, the purpose is forced cooperation, and any of these methods are, like whatever is to get people to function more harmoniously. And in theory, we could just function harmoniously without the ritual, but no, we can't. And so there has to be a ritual, and whatever the ritual is largely arbitrary. But
yeah, what's not arbitrary is the fact that the ritual exists.
Yeah, because there has to be forced cooperation, and forced cooperation has to come through the group participation in a ritual.
Yeah, exactly. That's like.
Can I ask?
Go ahead.
Can I ask both of you your thoughts on Agora?
I don't think I'm familiar with it. Sorry. Was that what's his name?
Agora. Agora is the basically the left-hand path of Hinduism. It's
you said Agori. You're talking about the guys who are living in the fucking boneyard smoking weed.
Yoga flame.
Yeah. Whenever I have a bad day, I sometimes wish I was one of those Agoris, because like, what a life. You're just smoking weed all day and meditating. You don't have to deal with any bullshit at all, except possibly having to eat decayed flesh. But who cares if you're in this blissful state of meditation all the time, right?
No, there is a positive aspect, because my Doovid's first exposure to yoga is from the Agore, who, the character Taoism in Street Fighter 2, who when I was young went to the arcade over and over again. Taoism, this yoga flame, yoga fire, was an Agore. And that was, thank God, like whatever my karma was, that my first exposure to the concept of yoga was through the video game Street Fighter 2, and
I love that game.
The gory character Taoism, who happened to be my favorite character. I was very known for destroying people with Taoism because I had a natural inclination towards yoga.
Dalsim and E Honda were mine.
I mean, I think it really it tells a deep story about the philosophy of yoga, because I think people who are completely uninitiated would see that and think, oh, they'd be repelled by that. It's like, who the hell wants to live in a boneyard and smoke weed every day? But then it's like, when you want to be a yogi, you're like, fuck, why the fuck wouldn't I want to live somewhere where nobody else is going to go, where I don't have to work and I don't have to do anything, and everything's going to be provided for me, and I could just meditate all day. So it sort of shows the Agori is illustrative of the difference in philosophy between the yogi and the non-yogi, I think.
Yeah, and there's some mystery or misunderstanding, and it's like, I don't know if the Agori, the over the cannibalism, or the people to so say maintain the crematoria on the Ganges. And in saying there's the task, and saying, okay, like there has to be respect for the dead. In India, there's a substantial amount of dead bodies, and there's a caste of people that do that task of cremating bodies, and the priest, that go around with the cremated ashes, and that's so you think about that yes, that serves an important societal function, but from the person who does it, like who's going to be the priest that walks around in the the ashes of cremation?
I'd be down. It sounds like it's just like it's the most uninterrupted life. It's the most low maintenance life that there
See,
is, isn't it?
Agora is actually the path, and Agori is a follower of the path. Agora, the philosophy behind it is actually really interesting. Basically, what it is they see themselves as life. In a sense, I guess you could call them Mayavadi.
I think
Um,
that normally they're Shaivite Brahmins, devotees of Shiva.
Yeah, but the philosophy of the
In my
path of
advice, just like
Agora.
I am God, that they have some sort of conception that they themselves are God,
Well, they
or that
see
everything is God, and that like
they
it
see
doesn't matter. You
everything
could
is
do
God
actions
and
that
everything
are,
is divine, and they want to be part of just life as life.
and that's
So
the
so
theological
when they
justification for
when
forbidden.
they're eating feces or eating a dead body or covering themselves in ashes or doing any of this crazy shit, what they're really doing is breaking down their own objections to different aspects of life.
I mean, you could even compare it to like the sabbatized Svi, concept of perfection through sin, or something like that. At least spiritually, the mechanism that and why it said they're Mayavadi, because Mayavadi is saying like, well, God is here, God is there, God is in sin, God is in good deeds. But I mean, not that simple. It's just saying like, oh, you could do anything, but you may be a specific mechanism and understanding for certain things that are largely frowned upon and forbidden for larger society, that there's a deeper spiritual mechanism being revealed here, and there's a special path for the people that could understand spirituality on this level, to even things like the issues of reincarnation, that the things that the biggest fear of people, death and the crematoria. And here's these priests that the smoking ganjas walking around with the ashes of the crematoria on them.
See, I'm not familiar with Sabotage Zevi in depth. My understanding of him was that he declared himself the Messiah and said that all the things that are sinful are now salvation, basically.
Yeah, I mean, somewhat. That's why I said it's a similar comparative, at least a comparative religion concept.
There is another take on all this, and that would be the chaos magic take. Now, I'm not sure if any other religion or pathway, spiritual path, has this exact take on it, but chaos magic in particular sees doing all these crazy things, drugs, orgies, eating feces, eating dead bodies. It proclaims this as a sort of karmic shakeup. You're basically breaking off parts of your own karma by doing all this crazy shit.
Yeah, that's a misinterpretation of the traditional left-hand path. So the left-hand path is basically meant to be undertaken when the conditions are very degenerate and one has to break taboos in order to recalibrate people's minds to not a state of non-degeneracy. For example, I used to go around naked in my past life because people were just way too uptight, So it's like, yeah, I'm gonna walk around naked because you need to learn that lesson. So that's basically what it is. Like the quote chaos that's being introduced by Left Hand Path is with the goal of bringing back order, not with just chaos for its own sake, which appears to be the chaos magic way.
Yeah, I mean, from the pure axiomatic system, say like, okay, like what if evil was good and good was evil, or if you're just saying like, like from a theological axiomatic system of what if there is no evil and the taboos that we hold to be evil are in fact just taboos, and or karmatic calculations, that there could be some very something that in essence is bad. However, due to some complicated calculation of karma, that in this circumstance it is good. So like, yeah, that's not abnormal. And so any new age magician type thing, you could be classified in greater Hinduism, and Hinduism will have a larger theology to fit that into. And probably in the West, largely fall under Freemason, that they mostly, Crowley included, will lean on the Freemasonic structure, absent Hinduism. And the Freemasonic structure is usually sufficient and quite decent for organizing, these systematic beliefs and operations. And then, so to say, cult crafts of, guilds of magicians who have, created a cult around collective ritual. And those collective rituals can be arbitrary, or they can be designed around a common spiritual science. And there might be reasons, God forbid, like to have demonic rituals, and could be an initiation purpose to say that we fill certain functions in society that include demonic elements. So the initiation rituals include demonic things, and say, okay, if you're signing up to be a priest, you like it, and that's why you see in entertainment, Aleister Crowley in general, but a lot of the Hindu Hindu people that have came over to the West, and the various Western masters of spiritual musicians are most seen in the world of entertainment and musicians, and even Freemasonry in general. That the most visual place that people know of, like Freemasons, is that this person was really a Freemason, is probably in the field of music and entertainment.
Well, musicians and entertainers probably have the most freedom.
They're the most likely,
resource-wise.
They
have the most
people
freedom
to have performed and participate in the type rituals you're talking about.
Well, what I'm saying is they have the most.
Do you agree that from what you're saying, of all the rituals and type things you're talking about, that you're most likely to find that among if you say magicians, specifically magicians, but entertainers and singers in general, musicians and entertainers in general.
Well, I would say, given that they have more resources, which gives them more freedom to be able to do these things, they would be more likely than the average person to have done them.
Yeah, and so when you find them in contemporary society, in history, you could say occasionally, like royalty, or like the son of some wealthy businessman might get caught up in these type things. And from the scientific perspective of spirituality, like greater Hinduism could classify it and say, yes, there's certain calculations where this is the correct karma, but it's not a recommended path. It could legitimize the path and say, yes, there will always be a certain element of people that will need to bear this path and continue it, because these rituals and practices are in fact important, but it will never be a dominant mainstream path.
Yeah, that's sensible.
Yeah, like this is never going to happen that the majority of society wants to be an agori, right?
And usually, like they say, like you don't choose the path chooses you, in those type ways. That the people, say, like no one would choose to be an agori, but because the path has to be, perpetuated, till some future time when that path is no longer necessary, that agori has to choose people every generation to continue that path. I mean, there might be traditions and Brahmins or people who go into it, or like people, but like even on the Indian countryside, like what kind of person, grows up and like, I'm going to become a gori.
I would. It sounds awesome. It's the best because it's the least amount of. You have to do the least amount of work.
Is it because you chose the path, or is it because the path chose you?
It's because
Who doesn't want to throw yoga flame?
I just look at all the different paths and I evaluate them as to which one of them is going to involve me to be entail me being involved with pedestrian things, and the Gori has the least affiliation with pedestrian things, and yogis despise pedestrian things. So yeah, I mean, it's totally appealing. I don't think a Gori chose me, and nor am I an Agori in this life, but I definitely appreciate it, and I see the appeal. And if things were going better, I could definitely see myself spending a lifetime doing that, because you just be able to do so much meditation. It would be so peaceful. So calm.
I miss being able to do a lot of meditation. When I was living out in California, I would meditate for 3 hours a day.
Yeah, like that has a massive effect on your overall state of mind, because meditation is calibration. So you're spending.
That was some of the most beautiful times of my life.
Yeah, so I mean, it's just the Agori path is for people who have spent a lot of time meditating and really enjoy it, and don't particularly enjoy pedestrian materialism, and they see it as like an annoyance more than a blessing. It just depends where you are on your path.
Am I incorrect that the Agori run the crematoria?
Yeah, I just pulled up the Wikipedia a minute ago, and it says a small group of Vamacharic ascetic Shaiva sadhus. They engage in post-mortem rites and dwell in charnel grounds, smear cremation ashes on their bodies, and use bones from human corpses for crafting kapalas, which are skull cups, and jewelry. Their practices are sometimes considered contradictory to Orthodox Hinduism, but I don't see it that way.
Well, if you think that's why I'm making a difference, that the Agori are performing a necessary societal task that most Hindus would respect, and saying like, yes, someone has to run the crematoria, and it's in essence, it's a dirty job, but someone has to do it, and these priests that do it have garner a certain amount of respect, and that's not the same thing as how we meditating in California as like volunteering to run the crematoria.
No, it's not the same thing. It's just, but it steps on the same path towards the same end, right? It says many Agori gurus command great reverence from rural populations, as they are supposed to possess healing powers gained through their intensely eremitic rites and practices of renunciation and tapasya.
And they're the ultimate champion of the little guy, so to say, the masses of people that no one cares about and died, that they performed the last rite rituals on, saying like in Judaism, it's called chesed shel emes, the ultimate charity that you do for the dead, because the dead could never repay you. So the Agori are somewhat like these, humanitarians that perform these last rite rituals on people that no one else is willing to perform these last rite rituals for. And if you're a believer and say like, yes, like karma would be, if there weren't the Agori here and these bodies were just piling up without these last rite rituals, there would be an extreme increase in the state of bad karma and suffering, because like, no, the fact is those rituals are important and someone has to do it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it says a lot about a person, if they can understand that, versus if they just dismiss it as a primitive practice. I think it's hugely important. And I think it's really sad that we bury dead bodies. Like, it just really seems to stunt the
well, I would say no, Judaism is the opposite. I'm saying that we actually collect the blood and bury it. I'm saying that no, I mean the Agori are commendable because they honor the dead, but you don't have to turn that into an argument in favor of cremation over burial. I mean, saying that in India it may be beyond the means, like you couldn't have a burial society, but the concept of honoring the dead.
Well, on a long enough timeline, nobody can have a burial society, because everything is just going to be cemeteries.
Well, no, I mean, in biblical times, families, graves now where everyone has a separate grave marker, but I'm saying you could have burial and then over a few generations collect the bones together. So historically in ancient biblical Israel, that's the archaeological evidence would show that they had family burial plots. and after decades or a few generations, they would collect the bones together into a mass grave and reuse them. So, no, I mean, you could have a continuation of burial. I mean, we don't have to turn this into a reincarnation versus burial argument to say that the Agori, in theory, are doing the most noble of all causes. And and I was comparing it to a Jewish burial society, even though obviously reincarnation and burial are opposite practices at death. But I'm saying that yes, there is a mythology of the Agori, that some people hold that some of these priests are really hundreds of years old and secretly run the world. Not like Jewish banking conspiracy, but like somehow these priests in the crematoria like have the spiritual karmatic reserves to control world events, and it's because of this mythology of this person, the person that's doing the most unfathomable unwanted task of performing the death rites on the countless dead bodies in India, and dipping them in the Ganges and burning them, and then saying the mantras, and even accepting the bad karma by bearing the ashes of those people on themselves and walking around like that. So I mean, it's really a fascinating thing. Is like Jonathan first said, a sign of someone who has advanced understanding of spiritual concepts to understand the function that the Agori play, and why even some mainstream Hindus would say, no, those are commendable people.
Yeah, I can understand why they say it's outside of the domain of Orthodox practices, but at the same time, it's like, well, you don't like it, when you're reincarnated as a Agori, you do as you like. If they want to make musical instruments out of skulls, I say let them. And smoke weed every day, whatever. If it's fuck it.
Smoke weed every day. And
it could have karmatic effects too. You're saying, okay, these people aren't just besmirching the dead the memory of the dead and making skulls because they're cannibals, but I mean it's a karmatic effect of the reality that there are so many dead people that no one cares about, and it's left to the hands of these priests to run the crematorium to see to it that at least some minimum form of the proper ritual is performed, to care for that person's soul, or however you understand it. And so if you see the guy who performs that task, like smoking weed out of a skull or something, it might even have spiritual significance. Or you see it's a dirty job, and just like a surgeon or something, saying if that's your job and that's what you do, you might find yourself smoking weed out of a skull, like I was telling you.
Yeah, exactly. The lesson is that it's not the laity's job to judge the Brahmin. It's the Brahmin's job to judge the laity, and any judgment imposed on a Brahmin by the laity is de facto a bad judgment. It shows that they lack judgment, don't know their place, right? So you could argue it's like, go ahead.
If you ever actually see the devices, the instruments, and the capalas that the Agori make out of the dead bodies, they're actually very beautifully ornate. They're not disrespected at all. They're made into something better.
Yeah, and think of it like this: like, people fear death, and part of the job of the priest is to help people deal with their fear of death. So sometimes the shock of seeing a skull, used in that manner, might help someone ultimately make peace with death.
And in a way, it's also like honoring them beyond their death. They've been given a purpose after their death, and they're being respected while they're fulfilling that purpose.
I think traditionally the perspective is like your skull is not your soul. So anything done to a dead body is not really anything that is going to hurt. It's not going to increase suffering because the soul has left the body. And there's that lesson too.
There's clear Vaishnava etiquette, and it's even laid down in the Vedas that includes taboo about how you handle the dead. And I mean, in general, you can't just for your own whim and sake of it have disregard for the dead body event of anybody, because there's Vaishnava etiquette that includes compassion and respect for the dead.
And I completely agree with you that protocol, it is honorable to adhere to protocol. I was just sort of, I guess I was playing devil's advocate. I was saying, like,
But I don't put in
sometimes
any manner
lessons.
that there's not clear Vaishnava protocol that would likely be in
Well,
violation
point to
of.
me where it
There
says
would be an
point to me
understanding
where it says that in the Veda. Point to me where it says that in the Veda.
about the requirement to honor the dead,
Well,
or
point to me
not
where
to
it says that in the Veda.
not to desecrate dead bodies.
Well, show me where it says that in the Veda.
Right,
Well, there is an argument to be made about whether or not decorating a skeleton and then maintaining it for spiritual use is desecration or not.
Absolutely, but the point is that it's a question that only certain people are even able to understand what the question even is, and so there's a lot of lessons that can be forthcoming from such rites. That's sort of what left hand path is breaking taboos for the purpose of greater teachings, right? Because obviously it's better to be modest, but if people are ashamed of their bodies, then maybe you got to balance it back out by walking around naked for a little while and just get people like, okay, like, get over it. You have a naked body, just fucking get over it, grow up type thing. Same with death. It's like, oh, you're scared of death? Okay, well, I'm going to play xylophone on a fucking skull cap because reasons, and now you're going to fucking get over it type thing. Like, it's the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law debate. So yeah, there may be, written laws, but those wouldn't be considered Veda.
In all honesty, I have actually wanted to get a hold of Kapila since 2012.
What's that?
A Kapila?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with what that is.
A Kapila is a bowl made out of a human skull.
So I'm not suggesting people do that. I'm just saying, like, situational, right? Like, I'm not suggesting people go get a skull or whatever to teach someone a moral lesson. I'm just saying that there's a certain amount of I don't want to say a gray area, but there are exception clauses, because ultimately what your goal is minimizing suffering, and what's going to minimize suffering at one point may not minimize suffering at another point. Like, society goes out of balance in different directions, right? Maybe sometimes they're too prudish, or maybe sometimes they're too sexually permissive, and the remedies for those things are going to be different, obviously. So that's why, again, it's spirit of the law versus letter of the law. Like, there is a certain amount that is dictated by, or a large amount dictated by, the circumstances. Like, if I was going to walk around naked right now, it would be counterproductive, right? Because people are too uninhibited sexually. Whereas in a situation,
if you were to walk around naked, we would all be very, very distracted.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, it wouldn't have a good effect if I was going to do it now, so I wouldn't do it. But if people were like way too puritanical to the point where they like hated their naked bodies, I might do it for that purpose, right? So it all comes down to an intentional thing, and also a circumstantial thing. Like, we are at a point. I don't think anyone's going to disagree that we're at a point where society is imbalanced in the direction of being way too sexually permissive.
It's to the point where if you are not promiscuous, you are seen as bad.
And that's just really sad, because, like, these people that I've known that have had these kind of casual relationships, it just never ends well. It's like, it cheapens it, kind of like the prostitution effect on sex. Like, probably just sucks to have normal sex when you're a prostitute, because it's like cheapened. And then that's what this cultural current that you're describing is sort of driving people towards commodifying sex. Like, yeah, basically what you're saying is if you're not promiscuous, there's something wrong with you. Is basically what the narrative is, right?
If you are romantically involved with someone, sex is very different than if you're just having sex for sex sake. Like with a prostitute,
that's what's happening.
You don't get too many people who want to make a prostitute feel good about themselves before they go and do the deed.
Yeah, it's like the other end, right? Like you have one end where like sex is sacred and it's between, you know, a husband and wife and save yourselves. That's like one end of purity, and then the other end is like straight up commodifying sex, where it's like, yeah, I'll give you a hand job for $15 type deal. And by having casual sex, people are like moving towards from one extreme to the other, right? Like it's a continuous distribution. So it really is toxic. I don't know how we got on the subject initially. You were, how's it going there, Doovid? What do you think? Do you want to wrap up soon?
You would wrap it up. Wrap it up. I was looking. I mean, it looks like. I mean, that's what I say. The role of the Agori praiseworthy. That there is a Vedic injunction to cremate a dead body, and even
I'm not
within
going to deny. I'm not going to deny that. I mean, that's why I mentioned it earlier. But in terms of what to do with the skeleton, I doubt there would be much commentary as to what to do with the remains, because they knew that the mind was long gone by the time the body was cremated. So I don't see why they would have any issue with anything being done with bones on that basis.
I mean, in terms like a biblical, like define like a respect or some sort of prohibition of desecration, or even to say a cremation, if it's done properly, is there supposed to be bones or not? And saying, you know, is it you know, what's the standard of cremation? Is it a cremation that leaves bones, or a cremation that, you know, obviously would require you know, hotter temperature and longer fire that would, you know, even destroy bones?
That's a good question. Does like how? I'm curious.
And then that could be the significance of using. You know, so it would have to. What type of Vedic literature do the Agori rely upon? What's the basis?
Just the ahimsa. It's the ahimsa paramo dharma principle. It's minimizing suffering.
But I'm sure there's some sort of scriptural reference for those ceremonies, and it's an important function. So it's not just like, you know, like, oh, randomly there's some random sect of Agori that you know, now dominate the crematoria. That presumably there's a Vedic your function that requires that to be done on karmatic grounds, that you can't, you know, just have dead bodies pile up. They have to have the rites performed on them. And there's probably Vedic literature that details those rites that are supposed to be performed. And the
rites would be something that the Brahmins would come up with, so that wouldn't be Vedic. It would just be considered a convention. The conventions may differ from one location to another. That's why there's disagreements between them about whether certain things are acceptable or in line, because ultimately the judgment is, are you minimizing the suffering? And some people disagree, because it's like, if you're just doing something for shock value and nobody changes their mind, well, yeah, that doesn't diminish the suffering. If you're going to shock people with something that is a breaking of a taboo, there has to be a reasonable probability that enough minds will be changed to justify the temporary suffering you're going to inflict on the people whose minds aren't. So it's ultimately a calculation.
That actually reminds me of postmodernist art. They claim they're trying to change people's minds, but they're like throwing up on a canvas and calling it art.
Well, I'm taking even more to a, you know, a spiritual dualist level where it has nothing to do with the effect on people. There's a spiritual element that it's bad karma for dead bodies to not be properly cared for, and it's not necessarily anything to do with the lesson to the living. To say that there's an obligation to you know, say limit suffering, but limiting suffering includes the respects that has to be paid to the dead. You can't just have dead bodies pile up. They have to, you know, be dipped into the Ganges and cremated, and someone has to do it, or else you know, that will cause you know, some sort of kink in the balance that will lead to massive increases in suffering.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good argument. I mean, clearly nobody wants to be living around a bunch of decaying corpses. And as you said,
it has nothing to do with the people. There's a karmatic consequence to having dead bodies that aren't cared for, that has nothing to do with the current state of humanity. It's fact. It's bad karma, not because it teaches the rest of humanity a lesson, but that dead bodies that aren't cared for is just factually bad karma.
Karma
That
just
may-
means cause and effect, though.
Yeah. So okay. So you say, okay, if the last person to die, obviously, like if humanity doesn't continue, and obviously the last person to die, pardon, no one's going to be able to perform the death rites on the last person to die. So it's part of a cycle of birth and death, obviously, that the death rites of the people who died are performed by the people that are still alive, and the cycle continues. But at the same time, the death rite is not performed for the living. The death rite is performed for the body of the dead, and so, to some respect of so to say, the death rite is performed for the sake of the soul of the person who used to reside in that body. It's not performed as a lesson for the living.
I think it's performed, for the benefit of society in general, but for that person in particular, like death rites are to help somebody with the process of reincarnation and to make that as non-suffering as possible. That's like the main intention, but it's also this is a societal function, like you say, to sort of keep it organized. And
Yeah, but so what
I
happens?
see it much
What
more
happens
as
to the
a
backlog of is there a backlog? What happens if the Agori didn't do that function, and then you had just a whole bunch of
well, you
bodies
got a bunch of
into the Ganges and didn't get cremated?
you're just gonna get a bunch of basically non-quieted, non-living entities floating around like you're gonna get like a haunted house effect, which is basically what we're living in right now. There's like a haunted house effect of spiritualism where there's just a lot of basically confused entities out there because they didn't have proper death rites, and they were
Yeah,
told something was going to happen, and then it didn't happen, and now they're just confused and lost and floating around and trolling people.
I see death rites more as a societal function because karma is something that's going to happen anyway. A death rite really does seem to be more of an honoring of the past, remembering the past, and learning from the past. What we have right now is a civilization that is actively trying to forget the past.
We're giving a functional explanation, and I'm saying that no, I mean, it's not that the death ritual fulfills some sort of anthropological function. The death ritual is an absolute karmatic event beyond an anthropological function.
Well, it may very well be, but I can't really speak to that myself.
I thought we were saying that everything.
Why not? I mean, haven't you?
Well, can't everything be reduced to an anthropological function?
Well, just say, why can't you speak that to yourself? Haven't you died many times?
Well, everything can be reduced to an anthropological function, but when it comes to things concerning the afterlife, I don't believe that we have any actual power to change anything that happens in the afterlife.
Well, maybe you don't.
Well, I mean, we can control our karma. We can do things to balance out our karma, or even make positive karma. But we can't. I don't believe that we burying a person with their feet facing east. I don't think that does anything.
It's a self-ascribed meaning, right? To a large extent. Like if you believe that being buried a certain way is going to be bad for you, then it will be. But if you don't have any associated belief, you're not going to give a shit. So it is down, whether it's offensive depends on what's considered the norm. Like stuff like that, oh, someone's got to be buried this way, oh, they got to be burned at this temperature. That's a cultural thing. It only has the potential to increase suffering if there actually exists a socially accepted norm, which in a lot of cases there doesn't. Yeah, I don't know if that made sense.
Well, I mean, that's disputed. Saying that, no. I mean, some people say that ritual is absolute in terms of the karmatic effect, how the mantra being pronounced exactly correct, and all the parts of the ritual being performed to precision has an absolute effect on that person's karma. So the person's reincarnation or the effect in their next life has some sort of direct proportion to how correctly the death ritual of their previous life was performed.
No, that's absolutely true, I guess. It's true on an absolute level. But then there's like sub-truths where people's individual subjective beliefs, though false, do affect their karma. Because it's like, it's down to cognitive dissonance again. It's like when my grandmother died, her consciousness, like her body didn't die for a couple days after her consciousness left her body, because her consciousness came to me after, an event or whatever, and her body was still alive but brain dead basically after this event. And a bunch of black birds came and just gathered on this tree, and they were just screaming really loud, and I could like feel her presence and stuff, and I could definitely affect her state of mind through that. So yeah, I can affect the person's state of mind and help their karma, because they're afraid, because they're dead, and they don't, it's a scary thing to die.
Wait, you said she was still alive, but she was basically brain dead.
Her consciousness left her body, but her body was still alive for like 2 days, I think. But she was brain dead. But yeah, that's what happened.
That seems like a circumstance in which the consciousness would have been non-localized.
When you die, it becomes delocalized. That's what death is. Delocalization of consciousness.
Yes, but how long after death does a consciousness reincarnate?
It depends on your karma. Less than 100 years is pretty standard. I give it, for the average person, maybe 15, 30 years. It's approximate. It really depends. Like, because like it's an electromagnetic question. Are there entities out there that are sufficiently coherent with your quantum mind to be your parents? There just may not be anybody who is sufficiently coherent to reincarnate you for a while, right? And what has to happen is your mind has to undergo a decay process, because it has to be small enough to fit inside a 5-week-old fetus. So there's a certain amount of like entropy / time that has to go by before the mind is simplified, sort of decayed down to a state where it even can reincarnate. And that is all down to personal karma. And it's all down to basically how you experience the event of death. Because for most people, death is going to cause cognitive dissonance, because they're expecting something, it doesn't come, and then they panic. And then the panicking causes the decay of the mind to accelerate, which increases the panic, which accelerates it more. And so that's why you really do need these death rites, so that at least people know what to expect. Yeah, it's going to feel like this, and hopefully I don't experience any shock on the reincarnation process. Pretty, probably pretty scary stuff.
That makes sense, but I would probably say that reincarnation can occur much more quickly than on the scale of decades.
It probably can. It's just a practical question. From the reincarnations that I've known, it's like sub 100 years. Usually, 15 to 30 years is about the average. I have met people that I can tell they're the reincarnation of a historical figure, right? So, just from my own research. And I purposely took birth 100 years after I died as a big fuck you to my competition. Basically, anybody who wants to say they're greater than me, well, you do something that great. Because that's pretty accurate timing. So I imagine 100 years is a high achievement.
I have this hypothesis about, I'm not even sure what you would call it, the incarnation of the sun, or of the consciousness of the sun, because once every 2,150 years we enter into a new age, and with that is supposed to be a new a new representative of the Almighty or whatever
the
you want to
solar
call it.
deity. You're talking about
Yeah.
the solar deity.
Yeah, basically. So I have this hypothesis that there's someone who reincarnates only once every 2,150 years.
Vishnu.
Basically, yeah. I would say he's been given different names throughout time and different cultures, but yeah, Vishnu.
Well, it's an interesting hypothesis. I mean, it's in the realm of metaphysics, so I would describe that as an aesthetic preference, and aesthetic preferences are, I guess, they're pseudoscientific, but to invoke aesthetic preferences as axioms is often a fool's game. But I mean, these things are interesting for their own sake, even if they're not true. Just entertaining ideas, especially when they concern cycles, is an interesting idea. Like, what if that is true? Oh, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. I don't tend to go for those types of arcs because I don't want to feed into apocalypse fetishism, but I'm just an ultra purist perfectionist. I don't judge you for.
I definitely want to feed into apocalypse fetishism.
Be careful what you wish for. All right, so I guess we'll wrap it up for tonight. Howie, did you have any final words?
Not really. This was a really fun stream. It was great.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. It's always nice to talk to you, and thank you so much for being open to what I said. I hope you'll have more questions in the future, and looking forward to talking again.
For sure.
Awesome. Okay, over to you, Doovid. Wrapping it up, any final words from the star of the show?
Yeah, I didn't have so too much interesting this week. Kind of like you hold up. I'm talking with Luke again. Hopefully every day again. We talked Henry Ford and tying together these various issues. So I'm enjoying that, but it hasn't produced necessarily that many larger insights or realizations to share. Always continue the scientific research. Not sure, the when I'm going to start producing these streams. I thought I'd do, just release one of these streams on chess and decision making, but I haven't had, I don't know, the energy or inspiration to do that. But hopefully at some point soon. And glad Jennifer, we're getting a little bit of a new crew, new circles, people coming on, sharing ideas. So hopefully that will lead to bigger insight. And thanks, Howie. The conversation about the Agori, very interesting, important understandings. And Cisco was good to hear from. I'm glad he came on. And hope his progress is progressing well. So with that, blessings to everybody. Enjoy your week, and Jennifer, enjoy your whatever you're doing, and hope to see you next week.
Thanks so much, Doovid. Thanks, Howie. Thanks, Michael, for coming on earlier, and thank you to the audience, as always, for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Look forward to the next episode. We will see you next week, if not sooner. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
So to say, a worthless opinion of.
It's so important that she can't be told, she won't be told that it's wrong. And
bringing it back to Church of Entropy and her attack dog Gandalf the White.
Why don't you learn to shut up and fuck your goddamn logic?
They control the media, and the media is capable of making the sheeple believe in anything.
Yeah, I don't mind. I mean, we've had these streams, and I've been doing Church of Entropy, and she's been bringing on new people, and we did those streams on stream etiquette. We walked through the technology.
I have like very strongly negative opinions of the kind of Brundle clique.
Is she trying to garner herself cult prestige by associating herself with a retard?